Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Rebel Clash, go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be going over the best and most interesting cards from the Darkness Ablaze set. It's been a long time coming, but we finally do have confirmation of what we're going to get in it. I'm joined by Jack today to go over all of the best stuff for the set coming out in just less than a month's time.
Yeah, and as usual, we're using this rating system that you guys probably know and love at this point, the 5-star rating system. Feel free to pause here if you want to have a bit more of an in-depth look into how we're rating cards. And also, as usual, we have included the community, the community's opinions, the community rating system. This was a form that Joe set up a little while ago for you guys to go and vote on how you thought these cards were going to do. And we got a huge amount of responses, nearly 150 responses. So thank you so much for everyone that joined in. We do these for every single set. So next time we're building up for a set, make sure you keep an eye out for this Google form and you can get involved too. So yeah, without further ado, let's kick off with the trainers.
And we'll be starting with the Cheer, Yell, Horn. Not necessarily the most interesting. It is a trainer card that says each player's active Pokemon is now confused. Relatively simple effect. It's dual-sided as well, which makes it kind of awkward because you can't just put this in as a disruption piece for yourself, for your opponent, because it also does yourself, right? You need to combine this with a switch card or have like a free retreater in the active or a Pokédoll or something like that to not be affected by it yourself, or you need to not be attacking at all. So it immediately limits the use of this card because it normally has to combine with other synergies. The only real thing that I could give it some merit to was adding an extra status condition for something like an Alolan Grimer attack that does more damage for each status condition that your opponent's affected by. So alongside an Amoonguss, that could be 3 statuses. You can then do 150 plus the base 20 plus 10 for poison. So 180 for a Twin Energy on a 1-prizer is like a little fun gimmick, but it's a lot of pieces that you got to get working. So I still think this is extremely fringe. I don't think it's strong enough for controlling archetypes. I didn't even really put any on the slide because really we don't know what control's going to look like in the next set. Is it going to be based on Toxtricity? Is it going to continue to be Lily's Pokédoll based? Is it going to be Curse Shovel shenanigans? We aren't really sure of where Mill's going to go. So even if half of those mill directions just won't want to play Cheer, Yell, Horn in the first place, so we have to give it that low rating for now.
For sure. Next up, we have Lookalike Bell. Lookalike Bell is a really, really interesting card. Search your deck for a Pokemon with the same name as a Pokemon in your discard pile, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So it's like a ball search card, but with a bit of a twist. You have to have discarded the Pokemon you want at some point during the game prior to using this. So it's actually a ball search card that generally isn't too good in the early game, but is a little bit stronger in the mid to late game when maybe you've had an attacker go down or you've had to research away one of your Pokemon. So, you know, it's a bit of a ball search card with a twist. The biggest use we could think of was the Mad Party deck, just because you want Mad Party Pokemon in your discard pile anyway to increase the amount of damage, and you want a lot of ball search in that deck just to be able to get the Mad Party Pokemon into your hand to then ditch them with things like Dedenne, things like Research. That was the only thing that we could really think of as to where this would be consistently useful. We have such searching options right now anyway with Quick Ball, Pokemon Communication, as well as things like Evo Incense and even Great Ball in some of our early Darkness Ablaze lists as well, being relatively prevalent cards. So in general, it's always interesting to get more ball search cards, and it's likely that this will see experimentation just because it theoretically is uninhibited search. You can search for whatever you want. There's no limit on the type of Pokemon you can search, and it's fairly easy to discard Pokemon or to discard cards in general in the format right now. But it's just nowhere near as consistent as some of the other options we have, so that's why it's only getting the 2-star rating from us.
Yeah, part of the reason we play so much ball search is so it can be used like on the first turn, so you don't just get donked, or so you can get energy down on your main attackers, and Lookalike doesn't fit the bill, so that's why it's got to be limited just to the Mad Party stuff. Next up, we come on to I don't know why this card was printed. It's old computer, the artwork's great, but it reads, flip 2 coins, if both are heads, choose a card from your discard pile, reveal it and put it into your hand. So 75% of the time you've added a blank card to your deck. And that's even on top of the fact that you could draw this before there's anything even in your discard pile that's useful. So like, let's say maybe 85% of the time this is a useless card. If you do flip two heads, like, I don't know what card you'd have to pick for it to actually be super useful. Like, it would have to be like a key supporter at the right time, or a special energy, or something like that, you know. But this is so niche and narrow that you're almost always not going to get the value from this card.
Certainly. Next up we have Rare Fossil, and we see the Sword and Shield version of the Fossil mechanic. Rare Fossil is basically the same as Unidentified Fossil, however, just with 70 HP instead of 60. Obviously, it doesn't have all of the various fossil interaction mechanics that Unidentified Fossil had, so it's already a bit worse because you don't have things like the Stadium or any of the supporters in this set, at least, to be able to search out the fossils like you could with some of the fossils that we've seen in the past. This does evolve into 4 different Pokemon all in the set. We're actually only talking about Arctozold and Dracovish in the set review today, because Dracozolt and Arctovish are not quite strong enough in our opinion to even be worth talking about. But in general, the fossil mechanics are never great because you can't start with them as basic Pokemon. You need to have other basic Pokemon. You then need to find the specific fossils to be able to then put them onto your bench. And as we've just said about ball search cards, we play such an inherently large amount of ball search cards in decks to be able to find Pokemon. It's actually quite difficult to find just specific items on specific turns without sort of a lot of dedication to it. And none of the fossils have really that kind of payoff that you want to be building a fossil deck anyway. So whilst they'll probably be seen for some sort of highlight reel moments, especially things like Arctozolt, I think in general, most of the fossils, as well as this new fossil, are really nothing to write home about.
Yeah, they feel quite subpar. Fossil mechanics always are terrible in general, and there's even item lock in this format, so even more reason to stay away at the moment. We move on to Turbo Patch, a very exciting trainer card that says flip a coin. If heads, choose a basic energy card from your discard pile and attach it to one of your basic Pokemon. Very reminiscent of Max Elixir. Now, in general, you could weigh the odds more than 50-50 in your favor when you were playing Max Elixir decks. Oftentimes you would play upwards of 13, 14 basic energy cards to get that extra acceleration online. But this Turbo Patch is still, universal acceleration for anything that isn't a GX. And although it is just that coin flip, we've seen so many cards previously be inhibited by that extra attachment here and there, that this Turbo Patch is just going to be a great addition to acceleration. For example, Vikavolt V already has Coco, but this extra Turbo Patch option can give you a little bit extra in that sort of mid-game. Same thing for the Zacian, Zamazenta, and other metal stuff. They already have those metal sources, so having Turbo Patch on top of that just make sure that you're not going to run out of attackers for the most part. There's also things like Sableye V, which has previously been seen as like too slow to just manual attach through the entire game if they get knocked out. But with Turbo Patches, maybe you can use them enough times to keep up in the game and make sure that you can chain attacks. So we're giving it the 5-star mainly for its versatility. It's going to make so many Vs more viable and stronger. And you can even try and combine this with like GX cards and use Energy Switch as well. So if you want to try and get that early ADP, we've seen people use Order Pad in current standard format for ADPization. So why not try and go for Turbo Patch with Energy Switch? Like Jack said earlier with the Lookalike Bell, we have Viridian, we have Dedenne, we have Research, we have a bunch of ways to have discard synergy cards to make the Turbo Patches live quite quickly. So I am relatively convinced that this will see play, or could see play, across a number of decks in our format.
Definitely. It opens up an engine for basically every V Pokemon that hasn't seen acceleration specifically for that type. Things that don't have access to Welder, to the lightning acceleration that we had in Standard. It definitely opens up a lot of doors, and for the 3 years that it will be in Standard, it will definitely see a variety of different... It will definitely see play in a variety of different archetypes, for sure. Next up, we have Big Parasol. This is a really interesting tool. As long as this tool is attached to your active Pokemon, prevent all effects of your opponent's attacks except damage done to all of your Pokemon. So anyone that was playing back in the DP era, the Diamond and Pearl era, you will recognize the text as being very similar to Unknown G. Unknown G was a very, very important Pokemon in that format, and this is Unknown G, but if it's on the active, it protects everything, which is obviously really, really strong. However, this isn't quite as strong as Unknown G was back in the day, because right now there aren't a huge amount of effects in general that this will be preventing. Dragapult is one of the biggest ones, and whilst Dragapult we don't believe is completely dead, that's probably one of the only ones that you'll really be seeing any prevention from the 5 counters from Max Phantom. It does get you around things like Assault Tackle and Full Metal Wall GX, them discarding the energy, so that is definitely worth noting. And I think if it ever gets to a point where these kind of attacks are very, very relevant in the meta, then Big Parasol could be a little bit more relevant. Also gets around status conditions as well, but we actually have a variety of different ways of getting around status right now, so it's not the best status counter either. The biggest reason why we're giving it a 3 though is basically it has a very, very Stealthy Hood vibe to us. Stealthy Hood was a card that was basically binder fodder until exactly Ability Zard was born at Worlds, and all of a sudden Ninetales became the best Guster in the game, and all of a sudden equally Stealthy Hood became one of the best tools in the game because it meant that your really specific targets couldn't get Stealthy Hood, if they had a Stealthy Hood on them, couldn't get 9/10 up, and that made it a really, really strong tool in certain specific formats. And equally we feel like Big Parasol could definitely see that kind of ripple effect of being the count, or being an answer, an inclusion to deal with a deck in the format. Like we say, there's nothing major that you really want to be necessarily attaching this to right now to prevent. Dragapult, as we've said, is one of the biggest, and that will see an inevitable decline in play, but it's definitely worth picking up a couple of these just because it's the kind of effect that more than likely will see pretty important relevance at some point during its tenure in the standard format.
Yeah, we rarely give things brownie points for like future potential, but this isn't necessarily future potential. It could just be like a card that we missed, where the Parasol just sort of protects you from something, maybe a new archetype that is born from this set, for example, and then it's like, oh, this is an important enough card to have as a tech right now. So yeah, we're giving it brownie points just because it's so dang versatile. Next up we have Mountainous Smoke. It's a bit less of an interesting tool card. When the Pokemon this card is attached to is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, your opponent puts any prize cards they pick into their discard pile instead of their hand. So in a way you are preventing your opponent from drawing, in effect. Sometimes it can be 3, 4 prizes even if you've gone up against an ADP GX attack and they've taken a big knockout on a 3 prizer. So you can see that it is somewhat denial. It's also resource denial in a way as well, because they can't access those cards. They're not just not drawing them in the first place. But there's a few issues here. First of all, it has to compete with a decent array of tools that we have in the format right now. Big Charm being naturally just like a health buff to keep you out of range. Air Balloon for some versatility. Giant Bomb maybe becoming more important with some more one-hit KO options out there with the Eternatus decks in particular. So I feel like it's already in tough competition because tools are so important. But also just the fact that we already have Reset Stamp and Marnie. These feel like much more naturally strong cards than the Mountainous Smoke, because people can gain big hand sizes without the help of their prize cards. So you may need to play Mountainous Smoke and then still have these disruption cards. So it definitely feels like it's an additional option rather than just like filling those spaces. So it's going to commit a lot to your deck to actually see play, and we just don't think there's any deck that can really commit those spaces in the first place that sort of outweigh this over doing extra damage or gaining extra hit points, that sort of thing. And we do lose Mars from the Lieutenant Surge Chip combo, but there is still Jesse James around. If you want to try and make that work, by all means you can, but I don't think it's even going to see play in the future of controlling decks, in my opinion.
No. Next up we have Toughness Cape, and this is without a doubt, in our opinion, the most exciting tool from the set. Toughness Cape increases the maximum HP of basic Pokemon by 50, excluding GX Pokemon. So very important to note, it excludes GXs, meaning that tag teams aren't getting any bigger, which I think everyone is breathing a sigh of relief of. In general, this is a really, really strong tool though. 50 HP is a huge buff. We've seen Big Charm see play in a variety of decks, and that's a 30 buff, and you're getting an extra 20 HP on top of that, which is just like really, really strong. In general, it's going to be, as we move towards a more VMAX meta anyway, it will get a little bit worse, but there are still a huge amount of at least V Pokemon that we can use, along with things like Spiritomb and Phalanx that we've mentioned in here as well. This isn't just limited to V Pokemon, this is any one or I guess non-GX Pokemon, which is really nice. One of the biggest sort of things going for this card is actually its interaction with things like Spiritomb. We lose Hustle Belt in Spiritomb, but in general, pushing the tombs up to 110 HP, leaves them out of range of a lot of sort of damage counter placement, things like Mew, Galarian, Zigzagoon. Having this Toughness Cape, obviously with Hustle Belt it didn't increase your HP, it just increased your damage. But with Toughness Cape, you have that extra HP to then translate into damage if you want using Building Spite. But at the same time, you also have that little extra buffer, meaning that your Spiritombs are nowhere near as sort of weak and feeble to just a few counters here and there. So I think that's one of my personal favorite interactions with Toughness Cape. But even things like Zacian having 270 HP means that even with an ADP buff, Brave Blade won't be KOing opposing Zacians. You're going to need an extra damage counter here or there, either a Zigzagoon ping yourself or a Vitality Band. And if you're having to put Vitality Band, or if you're forcing your opponent to put Vitality Band on their Zacians, they're not putting Toughness Capes on themselves. So there's definitely a lot of numbers that this brings to the table. And I think in general, a plus 50 is just so strong. It's undeniable this is going to make some kind of dent in the format. The other big thing is, obviously we do get probably one of the better item locking variants we've had in a while, with Vikavolt V, and a Vikavolt V with 260 HP and item lock does sound pretty intimidating. So I think there's definitely going to be a lot of options for this deck, very much similar to Turbo Patch. As long as we have these really, really strong basics in format, we're definitely going to have room for this kind of tool. I feel like these kind of tools are never really going to be a 5-star unless they're absolutely groundbreaking, especially now that we have Tool Scrapper in format. And this kind of tool is definitely hurt a little bit more by Tool Scrapper, just because your opponent can control your knockouts if they're playing Tool Scrapper. So that's why that's one of the reasons why I've bumped it down to 4, at least, because this is more managed in formats, as opposed to where you're sort of front-loading the damage, things like Vitality Band. You're not really scared of things like Tool Scrapper, so you are a little bit more scared with Toughness Cape. But in general, the tool is great, and we'll definitely see play. It's definitely going to be something that you have to think about when working out what kind of numbers your deck can do as well, because I think you're going to have to know how you can deal with this bonus of 50 or extra 50 HP in a lot of matchups, to be honest.
Yeah, it's super versatile. I just think it's insane that Azama's Enter can now have the same hit points as an ADP, and it's a 2-prizer, and it's already got that annoying ability. So I think for tanking 2-prize V kind of focused deck sounds really, really interesting. Like even Torkoal, it can benefit from the new special Fire Energy as well. That can become, also 280 plus hit points. So these things get pretty big, and a lot of VMAX decks don't have space for Tool Scrapper, or they don't want to commit Tool Scrapper. Obviously the format may end up going down that route depending on that Toughness Cape, but I think for the most part people are going to have to focus in on beating Eternatus and a few other archetypes, like even Senti-Scorch from this set. So I don't necessarily think Toughness Cape is going to be on everyone's hit list, and Scrapper may be in low counts right now. It was only really played a little bit here and there in the previous format, and that was when we had a skateboard on every Jirachi going around. So I can see Scrapper not having a huge place in the game, so that gives me a lot of merit towards this Toughness Cape. I think it's got a good shot. Next up we have Struggle Gloves, the forgotten card of the set that we was one of the last ones we were waiting on confirmation for. It has the text, if the Pokemon this card is attached to has weakness to your opponent's active Pokemon's type, its attacks do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. So, for example, if a Dragapult is hitting into an Eternatus or a Crobat, thanks to a Dragapult having a dark weakness, you then do 30 more base damage. So it's trying to give you a fighting chance and make that ×2 weakness a little bit less relevant. Now, I was trying to think of what archetypes would actually need this the most, and I was thinking of Dragapult. Obviously, that's kind of the thing everyone's expecting, because it was one of the strongest decks in the format previously, and now Eternatus comes in to kind of bully it. The Struggle Gloves actually don't do enough to push Max Phantom into range of 2-shotting Eternatus even, so I think that's a little bit awkward. Obviously, Dragapult can have extra damage counter placements, but the main problem with committing something like this into your deck is that even if it's the most popular deck in the room, like the one that you have weakness to, that's only still going to be 25% of the field maximum, really. So there's a lot of games where Struggle Gloves are completely useless, unless there's weakness to like lightning or dark, where you can at least use it to like gust up the Denes, gust up Crobats, and just like with the extra struggle gloves damage, you can take knockouts like more cheaply. So I think it's like extremely niche, and it has to be some sort of archetype that has a weakness that can then be pushed into like damage where you're at least trading on each other to, I think, be useful. But I just don't think there are any examples of that in the format right now.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very, very niche tool, and I think, unfortunately, there's just no practical applications for it. Next up, we have Birdkeeper, a really, really interesting supporter from the set. The card reads: switch your active Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon, then draw 3 cards. So it's a bit of a combination between, well, it's exactly a switch plus a hop. We've seen a similar effect on an Olympia, however, it healed 30 instead of drawing 3. And Olympia saw niche play, it was not completely irrelevant, so you definitely have to look at this card and think, okay, this isn't just a write-off. Any additional switching outs in general in decks are always great. It's a little bit more painful when they are supporter-based, but you do get to draw some cards with this, so it's also a consistency card. And in general, we're getting a couple of interesting retreating options, things like Hide Dark Energy, as well as needing more outs for Jirachi to switch anyway, so this is a fairly well-placed card in the meta. Unfortunately, it is in a meta where we have Research, Marnie, and Boss's Orders, and if you're not playing, around 10 to 12 of those supporters overall, if you're then looking to play more supporters, maybe that's the kind of place you're going to be adding in Birdkeeper. But in general, it's so outclassed by other supporters that I think this will only ever see niche play, at least for a little while, until we really have a position where we need both this switching effect as well as a draw 3 cards effect. Interestingly, it does lend itself to the Sky Circus deck, which we'll talk about later on, which is built around using Birdkeeper every turn. So for exactly that deck, it's obviously great, but in general, we're not too impressed in the deck on the whole. Obviously, it will have very niche uses, and it's very interesting to see these kind of supporters get printed. I like seeing supporters where they combine 2 effects so that you kind of get the effect of whichever one you need, but also get an additional effect at the same time. We saw a similar thing with Tate and Liza, but Tate and Liza was either switch or shuffle and draw 5. So I think this is probably a little bit better than Tate and Liza because you're always drawing cards, but it's obviously not as much of a bailout option as the other one was, as Tate and Liza was. So yeah, it's outclassed by a variety of supporters in the format, and I think that's unfortunately why Birdkeeper falls down. I think in another format this could be potentially a really, really interesting card, but things like Research, Marnie, Boss's Orders, in combination with other great switching outs like Scoop Up Nat, just mean that this card falls a little bit short in general.
Yeah, I agree. I'd even throw Erica's Hospitality into that mix now, with Eternatus being more of a deck. I think the only sort of credit I can give to Birdkeeper is if there is going to be a lot of Vikavolt trapping style lists, we might look to this as our savior, but at the moment it feels like the other options are just far stronger for draw. When I initially saw this, when we had a skateboard with Jirachi, I thought this card was insane, by the way. But the fact that now it has to combo off with a net or a switch makes me a little bit hesitant with that Stellar Wish package. And I think Jirachi in general is getting slightly weaker post-rotation. I still think it'll be the front runner of a lot of archetypes, but not necessarily in as many as we saw in the previous format. But Birdkeeper does still have good synergy there. Next up, we move on to Piers. It is the first of the dark support kind of cards we can talk about today. It's the supporter that says, search your deck for 1 dark Pokemon and any 1 energy, doesn't specify basic. Reveal them and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. I think this is definitely a reasonable card, kind of comes in that sort of category of Karina and Volkner, where it's relatively type specific, but can be versatile in a lot of situations. I think the main home you're going to see this in is the likes of Eternatus VMAX and Spiritomb. But you do have a couple extra Dark-type Pokemon which could be seen across a number of decks. Obviously, Crobat V, one of the biggest cards of the set, being a draw Dark Pokemon, means this Piers card could be a pseudo means of drawing. And because you can access some really nice special energy cards, it may lead to us having 1 or 2 special energies, even things like Capture Energy in those early turns being an option, similar to how we've seen Guzma sort of champion the way for a couple extra special energy cards just going into decks for a mini engine within the deck. Piers could end up having that sort of niche where you can get benefits from these special energy cards without too much downside, which could be very cool. Zigzagoon as well being a nice way to just pick up some extra damage here and there. So I feel like in Eternatus, I actually am not the hugest fan of the card. I feel like it probably shouldn't be more than a 2 count. Once again, we're saying that Research, Marnie, Boss, they're too good to not play. But he still could fill that niche. And again, if Vikavolt item lock stuff is really prevalent, you'll probably see more Piers. I think the reason why we've seen higher counts in Japanese lists of Piers is exactly because Vikavolt is a bigger deck in their format because of they don't have rotation, and they need to still find their Eternatus to actually do anything. So I think it's kind of getting slightly lost in translation a little bit of how insane this card is because it was played so much in Japan. But I feel like it's going to be a bit part player more than anything in Eternatus because Ball Search is still like so premium just so that you can have that decent early game to actually find your Eternatus in the first place, get energy down, etc. But it's versatile enough where it could fulfill that niche where you're playing a couple bats and a couple special energy and all sorts of other decks. For example, I've had like a couple Piers in Salamence VMAX lists in the past, and a few other VMAXs and other decks in general that just really rely on special energies could really take advantage of this. Even Spiritomb decks could use this, so I think he's just versatile enough that we're going to give him that 4-star.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really, really interesting card. And I do like that they try and push more type-specific stuff in general. But as we've said, this one has the luxury of actually being pseudo-consistency supporter as well because it searches out Crobat. So yeah, there's versatility definitely in this card, and I think it will see at least some amount of play. As we've said, we haven't enjoyed it too much in Eternatus, but I can see why you would also play it in Eternatus because basically turn 1 all that deck wants is Crobat plus energy drop. So it's it's also very, very fine in Eternatus. But in general, I think I just think the card is pretty strong, very versatile, and I think in combination with Crobat could be a very nice consistency engine for decks that don't have one otherwise. Next up, we have Rose, another really, really interesting card. Rose lets you choose up to 2 basic energy from your discard pile and attach them to one of your VMAXs, and then you discard your hand. So very, very high payoff. But obviously, you're getting 2 energy for the price of your hand. Not ideal because obviously you're going to need a hand to be able to continue to play the game, but we do get a couple of interesting cards as well as already having a couple of interesting cards in the format to be able to counteract this, which is interesting. Some of the best uses for Rose, first off, things like my personal favorite so far has been Inteleon. That's the one we've tested the most, and it actually makes Inteleon fairly consistent, but any of these options seem to be fairly consistent when combined with a Silvally engine, using that disc reload to then draw up to 5 cards after you have used the Rose. Obviously that's a little bit more work than the Rose Tower that we'll talk about momentarily, but Rose Tower only nets you 3 cards, so this does give you a few more options. And in general, I think there are definitely some merits to playing the Silvally engine over the Rose engine, even though it is a little bit clunkier. Obviously you've got things like Jirachi Stellar Wish to be able to bail you out, as well as Mewtwo stacking a supporter as your top deck next turn. So there's various ways you can get out of the quote-unquote dead hand that Rose gives you. And obviously the payoff is setting up a VMAX, and inherently these VMAXs often need 2 or 3 energy to be able to really get going with their strong max style attacks, which are usually pretty intimidating when they are going. So I think it's definitely an engine that we will see probably more and more of in general as more and more VMAXs come out. Right now, the 2 or 3 VMAXs that really or that are really good right now sort of have their own engines anyway. Center Scorch especially has the Welder engine, which unfortunately is just miles better than Rose because Fire has so much support anyway. Even though it loses a load of support, it still has things like Hearth. So in general, it's not going to be needed in Center Scorch. It's an okay one-of in things like Eternatus, where you're just digging for one last big blow-up at the end of the game. But as we've said, it's super important to be able to find things like Boss to close out games at the same time. So it's never going to be more than maybe a one-of in that deck, in my opinion, anyway, because also you have no nice way of building your hand back up outside of Rose Tower because you can't play Mewtwo, Jirachi, or Silvally. So you really can't lean into the Rose too much for the Eternatus deck. But I think in general, some of these lower tier VMAX decks that we've seen in the past, things like Inteleon, Stonejourner, that have been sort of tier 3, never really been able to break it because they just haven't been consistent enough. You can now actually relook at all of these. In combination with the Sylvale engine, basically you can build like 40 to 45 cards of this sort of Rose Sylvale shell, and then just add in your favorite VMAX at the end and see how it goes. And I think you're going to have a much more consistent deck than you were in the past. Whilst things like Welder are in the format, it's never going to be outshone by Rose. But in general, it's definitely nice seeing these kinds of seeing this kind of support for VMAXs. And I think in combination with the Sylvale, it's actually not as much of a downside as you think. As long as you prioritize your early turns, getting your Sylvale out, you're never going to pay for that, because at the same time, in the turns you're not using Rose, Sylvale is bringing you consistency anyway. So yeah, a really, really interesting card, and I think one that will probably get better and better over time as we see more VMAXs come out. But right now, there's probably a load of VMAXs. You can take a look back in the binder and see if you can build this Sylvale Rose engine and see if you're able to play your favorite VMAXs in a new way.
Yeah, it's definitely been a nice puzzle. I think the biggest issue is like you need to find 2 stage 1s and have discarded 2 energy like by turn 2 to get the full effect. So that probably means you're doing like Dedenne digs and that sort of stuff, even Crobat digs in the early turns. So you'll naturally have some easy prizes that your opponent can pick off. And if you aren't able to bin off energies early, you're ending up using these much worse early game attacks like Hydro Snipe for 60 and stuff. So it is kind of feast or famine. That's why we can't push it much higher. But when it does come off, it's been really good tempo, and tempo is good for these VMAXs. They really do take a lot of advantage from it because they normally stick around on the board for, at least a turn or two. So I feel like when it does come off, it feels great. So if you can get this guy to work, it's going to be powerful. Next up, we have Kaboo. You shuffle your hand into your deck, then draw 4. If you only have 1 Pokemon in play, draw 8 instead. Really is extremely niche. Almost every turn 1 of every Pokemon game involves your opening actions looking for Ball Search to populate your bench, and just saying no to that in the opening turns and then hoping that off the shuffle 8 you then hit your Pokemon in your Ball Search feels extremely risky. And then like throughout the entire rest of the game, Kaboo is like useless. So he's extremely niche. He's far worse than using things like greens, I would say. Possibly like alongside this in a greens deck, you could play like 1 or 2 copies, but I think in general the Tag Core package is just like far safer and far more usable throughout the mid game. So the real upside of Kaboo is similar to using like that turn 1 Lily effect that we've expected in the past, but you potentially even get more cards because you're shuffling in as well. But I can't even think of how many cards you can play down in your opening turn if you're not using Ball Search for Pokemon. So yeah, very odd card. Kind of goes against the grain of what you would want to do on every turn 1 situation. And in most other like situations as well, like potentially in the mid game you could just have 1 Pokemon left in play and stuff, but it feels like super all in, and I'm kind of against it, so I'm gonna just give it the 1 star.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting, and I can see where their mindset was coming from. If you only have 1 Pokemon in play, you're going to need to draw more to try and find more. But in general, you don't want to be building your deck around being behind. You want to build your deck. You'd like rather than putting 4 Kaboo in, thinking, oh well, I won't find my Pokemon, but I'll get an extra 4 cards. You're probably better off just putting 4 more Ball Search cards in, because the Ball Search can be Dedennes, Crobats, attackers. They can be so much more versatile than these 4 Kaboos. So yeah, I get where they were going with it, and in general, like things like Cynthia's Feelings of the Past have seen interesting effects where you're behind in some aspect, but this one is just way too much of a risk, because if you're at 1 Pokemon, there's still, like you say, always that risk of not even drawing another one and then the game's being over. So yeah, really, really weak card. Next up, we have Pokemon Breeders Nurturing, and unfortunately, this is another really, really outclassed card by some of the other cards we have in format. Basically, it's a double Evo Soda. Choose up to 2 Pokemon in play, search your deck for a card that evolves from each of those Pokemon, and put it on top of those Pokemon. To evolve it, you can't use it on the first turn or on a Pokemon that just came into play. So if it was like double Wally, insane, but it's double Evo Soda on a supporter when we have Evo Incense, that's not really seeing much play at all anyway, outside of in early lists from us at least. Things like the Sylvale engine, that's the only place we're kind of using Evo Incense, and even then it's a pretty low count, as well as Calm being in format and being more useful because you can search for basics, and Great Ball as well. We just have so many better options than Nurturing. overall. Things like Olivia, which had more versatility, you could search for basics or stage ones, or well, evolve Pokemon, and you didn't have to put them straight down. You could get their coming into play effect as well. Olivia saw very, very niche play. I think I remember like one deck in the 3 years it was out that it ever saw play in. So yeah, it's just another case of a supporter being outclassed by good items already, and the benefit of it being supporter is not worth the downside of having to play your supporter for the turn when we can just play Evo Incense or Pokemon Communication that are in general just more reliable cards overall.
Yeah, the problem is, before you find your evolutions, you need to find the basics in the first place, and that's why these versatile ball search cards just take precedent, even over Evo Incense. Like you said, Jack, Con is a 4 of first, and then Great Balls go on top more often than not, just so you can get those early game plays. My favourite thing about this card is actually the nod to the old Pokemon Breeder Fields, the artwork, the double Sunflora becoming the little Yampas and the Dragonite becoming the Wooloo. That is top tier illustration, but the card is terrible. Next up, we go on to the stadiums. We have Glimwood Tangle. Once during either player's turn, after they flip any coins for an attack, that player may ignore the results of the flip and begin flipping those coins again. It is a Victory Star Victini effect, this time on a stadium, and we have a surprisingly high amount of cards that enjoy coin flips. There are some in this set, even the Toxtricity that I know a few people are excited to play out. So yeah, we're going to give this a 2-star for some certain experimentation with some stuff in the format. There's some interesting other item lockers, like Psyduck with Headache. There's Ripping Horn from Seeking, which I actually think probably has the most promise here, because being able to discard multiple energy cards in an attack sounds very strong. At the moment, we only really have things like Yell Grunt and Crushing Hammers, and now that Orangaru's gone, you're not really infinite enough to get rid of enough energy to just deny the opponent. So potentially this is going to be a Glimwood Seeking kind of energy removal deck. Will be the way to go going forward if you want to out-resource the opponent. So it's an interesting one for sure. There's still that Toxtricity. There's some Kartana and Xatu stuff. You can try and put people down to 10 hit points a lot more consistently now, which is a little bit fun because people experimented with those in the opening stages as well. So yeah, there's enough kind of like mid-low tier options that I think people will give it some experimentation. Obviously, it's going to be worried by, Celtic Swell, so these decks are never going to get too popular. And so many decks naturally play a reasonably high stadium count in the first place. It's always contested. So you're going to have to commit 4 spaces to your deck, maybe even like Guzhala to your deck, especially for Toxtricity because you're relying on twin energies as well. So it's going to be this like whole package to build around it, which is a bit of a headache, a lot more work than Victory Star Victini, a lot more space as well. So I would prefer it to be an ability Pokemon more often than not, but there's enough coin flip cards that I think it's worth trying out.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is the kind of card that isn't going to break the meta day one, but 4 or 5 weeks into the meta where everyone's tried out and figured out what is tier 1, tier 2, that's when this card is really going to start to shine, just for the, like you say, the meme potential. There's 6 decks we can see on the screen right now that you could play around with this card. So yeah, for experimentation, it definitely gets a 2. Practicality, it probably is a 1, but in general, I think the card is too versatile to give it a 1 because there's so many options you can take this kind of this kind of card with. Next up, we have Rose Tower. I mentioned it earlier on when chatting about Rose. The card exactly reads: once during your turn, that player may once during either player's turn, that player may draw cards from their deck until they have 3 cards in hand. So it's Instruct on a stadium. In general, Instruct was really, really strong. Why isn't this as strong? Well, one, Instruct was basically uninhibited as soon as it hit the board. Obviously, we have counter stadiums as well as Chaotic Swell in general. So that makes Rose Tower weaker in general. Plus 2, 3 cards still isn't a lot. Orangaru, you're able to search quite early, and you're able to just supplement your draw every now and again with Orangaru. But in general, it wasn't in every deck in the format. It wasn't groundbreaking. It was fairly good, and it was in a fair few of decks, especially a fair few of our decks. But overall, it wasn't like the best card in format. And Rose Tower, I feel like definitely because of things like Swell and other options like Stamp, there's just a lot of ways of being able to manipulate hand size and manipulate the weakness of it being a stadium. It can draw you out of awkward situations from things like stamp, but at the same time, if you're getting stamped to 1, you're drawing a card for turn, so you're going to be drawing 1 card unless you can play anything. If you're getting stamped to 2, you can't even draw a card with Rose. So in general, it's not quite as safe of a sort of stamp out as something or as some other options in the format. And we think personally that the Sylvali engine is a better combination for Rose. When Sylvali goes, undoubtedly this will be the way you have to play Rose, but I think in general it's weaker than Sylvali, and because of things like Swell, it's just nowhere near as strong as it needs to be able to be a super competitive stadium. I think it will see play because at the end of the day it's still consistency, and if you don't need to play a specific stadium for your deck, it's probably worth considering something just to try and get a little bit of consistency if you can. But in general, I think there's probably better stadiums for almost every deck out there right now, unfortunately for Rose Tower.
Yeah, that's the main problem, I think. The most hyper aggro stuff I can think of is like Baby Blounds, and they probably have to play Hearths, maybe even like Hooper Spiritomb, another one prize deck. I'm trying to think of these decks that kind of crumble under Stamp, and normally they rely on other stadium cards in general. Oranguru was busted because it was a one space in the entire deck, and it could be that get out of jail free card at times, whereas Rose Tower feels like more commitment. It's got competition in every single deck, so there's only a handful that can even afford to use it in the first place, and we still have Stellar Wish. Stellar Wish is probably still the best stamp proofing mechanism that we have in the game, even without a skateboard, so I feel like those probably take precedent over Rose Tower for the most part. We move on to Spikemuth now, that stadium that I was just talking about with Spiritomb. It states, whenever a player's Pokemon is moved from the active spot to the bench during their turn, put 2 damage counters on that Pokemon. Definitely some nice synergy here, especially with the loss of Rainbow Energy. Spiritomb gets a lot slower. You also lose that Hustle Belt. So having some other means of adding towards your building spite is going to be really important to make that, or hopefully keep it relevant as a one prize deck, because a lot of one prizes get a lot worse. I think Spiritomb might be, with the help of this stadium, the only one sort of retaining its place in the metagame, with the help of the new Hooper as well. Obviously we keep Jinx, so you can try and retreat around all your stuff, even your own like Jirachis and whatnot, and switch even, and you can start using that Ominous Posture to move them how you like, which I think is very interesting. There's also a new Houndoom V that we'll talk about later that benefits from other fire Pokemon having damage counters on them, and maybe just switching out of one Houndoom into another, keeping one damage on the bench, and then you can attach to your new active Pokemon. That could be a way around it, or again, you can use some Jinx shenanigans for any other basic that you have, which is cool. It also could just end up being a damage supplement. Let's face it, a lot of people are still going to be playing things like Jirachi, and they're going to play switches still, although Scoop Up Net is a big deal. If you're using Scoop Up Block Mime, for example, you're forcing them to switch, and then that could be extra damage counters for things like Inteleon VMAX that we talked about with Rose becoming potentially more relevant. Or if anyone is bold enough to continue playing Dragapult, obviously we are losing Shrine of Punishment, so this Spikemuth could be another way to increase that damage output and make those counter placements more devastating. At the moment, I think it's probably exactly in the Spiritomb deck, and I don't foresee Houndoom being particularly strong. Inteleon may play 1 or 2 copies of this. I really wish it could work during your, like, you could affect your opponent's stuff during your turn with like Boss's Orders and Fiones and that sort of stuff. I thought that would have been really cool for design. But at the moment, it feels a little bit narrow to see a lot of widespread play.
Yeah, I think so too. It's a very, very niche, and these kind of stadiums usually do have one key deck that they're sort of big in. Things like Potown, Frozen City, Magma's Base, all had kind of one deck that they really shone in. And Spiritomb might be that deck for Spikemuth, but I'm not sure whether we'll see anything better or worse. It doesn't feel quite as strong as some of those stadiums did in the past, but it's definitely a really, really interesting mechanic, and one that I think could see a lot of creativity. Onto the energy, and we have Heat Fire energy first. Heat Fire is a fire special energy that provides a fire whilst it's attached, and if it's attached to a fire type Pokemon, it increases the HP by 20. So obviously nothing too flashy, but in general a really, really strong effect. We mentioned the Torkoal earlier on. That in combination with the cape can make it into a pretty big I think it would have 280, so that's as big as an ADP, as we mentioned earlier on. In addition to that, though, it increases the HP of some of these 3 prizes as well. Reshizard going up to 290 is nice, lets you use a little bit more damage with the Outrage, as well as these 3 prizes, these VMAXs, sorry, Cinderace and Sense Scorch, things like that, and any future fire VMAXs we get as well. Pushing the 340, even 360 range is just really, really monstrous, to be honest. Fire energy is, or fire in general, has been a very, very good type ever since Welder came out, and unfortunately, the fire typing is both the best part about this card and the worst part. Welder, Hearth, Fire Crystal, and Ninetales all require basic fire energy, which means that this will not activate any of those 4 cards. And these 4 cards, at least 3 of them, Hearth, Welder, and Fire Crystal, are basically the heart and soul of every fire deck right now. Ninetales is also very, very important. So in general, if you're thinking about putting Heat Fire in, you always have to keep your basic fire count fairly high just to be able to have outs to all of these different effects, which means you kind of have to really think about how much you want to lean into these Heat Fire energy. And in general, that's probably the card's weakest point, the fact that it is competing with quite literally the basic fire energy, just because basic fire is so versatile right now. It uses energy acceleration, you can search for it, you can get it from the discard, you can gust with it. It's just so useful right now. So unfortunately, it's competing with a basic energy that actually does more effects in general than just increase HP by 20. That being said, I think it definitely could see it be included as a 1 or 2 of in a couple of fire decks, because we have so much search for basic fire, you don't mind finding these Heat Fire and energy anyway. And whilst there's not too much special energy disruption right now, extra HP is always going to be really useful, especially if we're moving into a format where things can one-shot you. You can sometimes push out of the one-shot range, but also there's a couple of decks in the format which seem to be really consistently 2-shotting, and again, you can also push out of that 2-shot range, maybe into 3-shot range. So yeah, really, really interesting card. Unfortunately, competing with the basic fire energy just because of how versatile the basic fires are. But in general, this could easily be a 1 or 2 of in basically any fire deck, just because that extra 20 HP, it will definitely be relevant in certain matchups.
Yeah, basic fire is just too damn broken, so probably a 1 or 2 count, possibly, as long as you've shoved in like 13 plus basic fire first. We move on to Hide Darkness Energy, a very promising card, more dark support from the set. That is, the core theme here. As long as this card is attached to a Pokemon, it provides a dark energy, and the retreat cost of the dark Pokemon this card is attached to is now 0. It's a buffed version of the old mystery energy we had for the psychic type, now moved into the dark type, and there's a slew of Pokemon that really want to benefit from this. Eternatus normally has a 3 retreat cost, and now it can go to 0. And with 340 hit points, this guy can tank quite often. So if you can pivot him to the bench, that can be very useful. Also, that Hooper with the Assault Gate, it's essentially like a new Zapdos that we get, and a Zapdos that potentially has like a free retreat if it's not knocked out is like very, very strong. And it also has that extra synergy with the Spike move that we talked about earlier. When you're playing these Hoopers and Spiritombs, you can just promote one of them for turn that has a Hide Darkness attached, and then you can just move it straight out, start churning those Spike Muff damage counters around the place, which is very cool. And there's a ton of other Dark Pokemon that have even seen play before the Hide Dark was in effect. There's things like Galarian Obstagoon that used to have this sort of headache with paralysis on Raichu and stuff like that. Obviously, we do lose a skateboard, so it's not going to change too much, but it means that if you are up against like energy denial stuff and you've still retained that Hide Dark, you can at least like move out of there back into a Dull. Sableye V could benefit from this as well, just moving itself to the bench where it's maybe safer in those opening turns, because I believe that also has like a 2 retreat cost. Galarian Weezing has a 3 retreat cost as well, making it awkward for like a hit and run style Pokemon. Now you can maybe make it a little bit more versatile. So yeah, I think we've given it the 5-star because it will almost always be an Eternatus VMAX, and it will also be in this sort of 1 prize Spiritomb Hooper deck, but it also pushes any of these more rogue dark Pokemon as well. So super good card. There is still going to be things like Scoop Up Net and Giratina that remains in the format, so a small headache there. But otherwise, it's just like huge benefit to have this in your deck for extra switching outs.
Yeah, definitely. For exactly dark decks, it's a Floatstone plus an energy attachment on 1 card, so that itself should tell you how strong this card is. And yeah, it's going to see a lot of play during its time in Standard, so I'm really excited about High Darkness being in the format. The final energy is Powerful Colorless Energy, which is basically a colorless reprint of Strong Energy from back in the day. The attacks of the colorless Pokemon this card is attached to do 20 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. Obviously, a really, really nice effect. Considering we don't have much damage manipulation right now, the strongest tool we have, or good tool, I should say, we have is Vitality Band, which is just 10 damage. There's no Choice Band, there's no Muscle Band, there's nothing like that. So it's actually a much more significant damage buff than maybe it would have been a little while ago. And in general, we have some pretty interesting colorless types right now that can really benefit from just a little buff of damage to be able to, as I mentioned earlier on, push them into 1- and 2-shot range where they otherwise would fall short. Things like Dubwool really feels like a card that has not seen the play that a lot of people expected. It's such an efficient attacker, being able to attack for 3 colorless, so it's splashable, but at the same time, with a couple of powerful colorless, you can really, really be putting on the pressure, especially in a format where there's a variety of things like Dedenne, Crobat. There's a load of different things that you can really, really punish with Dubwool, so that's a really interesting one. Salamence and Snorlax are another 2 really interesting VMAXs, which, again, maybe see a little bit of a buff with powerful colorless. You're going to be running a couple of... You can really run these decks as kind of Porygon Z engines, which is what we have personally tried, which has been really interesting. Things like Capture Energy and Recycle Energy in general are really, really good for increasing the consistency of that kind of Porygon Z engine, and meaning that you always have energy to attach. So then being able to supplement your damage to make things like Max Wing and G-Max Fall do even more damage, and actually, like I say, push into that one-shot range is really, really interesting. Unfortunately, none of these decks have been super successful in our early testing. Salamence is definitely the one that has the most legs, and in general is still kind of underperforming because you're still playing this Stage 2 engine. There are arguments for playing things like the Welder engine, but then you're leaning into multiple types, and it can get a little bit awkward. You maybe not able to attach enough powerful colorless energy to be able to push Max Wing into certain damage ranges at certain times. So overall, it's not the most consistent, but I think powerful colorless energy is without a doubt an incredibly strong energy in general. We saw how strong the strong energy was overall, and whilst when strong energy came out, that came out with a plethora of good fighting Pokemon that meant it was immediately good. I think during powerful colorless's time in Standard, it will definitely be very, very relevant for any type of box deck in general that can drop in a couple of colorless attackers that again, you have this kind of Piers engine that you can really lean into with some of these really interesting energy cards, because you're also able to draw with Crobat as well. So I think powerful colorless will definitely be strong at some point. Salamence VMAX looks like the best place for it right now, but I don't think we're overall convinced on Salamance's placement in the meta. But I think with the right list, there definitely could be something there with Salamence, and therefore leaning on that powerful colorless energy as well.
Yeah, it's weird. I would normally say this is like competing with Recycle and Capture, and that would kind of give it minus points. But now we've got to this like critical mass where Porygon can benefit from all of these, and then it kind of becomes a thing, possibly. Still a Stage 2, but that's a lot of damage mod, and it can push Max Wing in particular into knocking out, tag teams, and when you're doing early Twin Sonics, it even sets up things like Eternatus and stuff. So yeah, potentially very, very solid, and definitely makes the damage output much more dangerous. We start with the Pokemon now, and we move straight into a V and VMAX combo. It is Butterfree. Unfortunately, not going to be that strong. The basic is a 190 hit point grass type that has Dizzying Poison. Your opponent's active is now poisoned and confused. It's decent for slowing your opponent down, of course. And you have that Blasting Wind attack for 2 grass and a colorless. You do 130. It's quite below the bar at this point in terms of damage output. 2-shotting like a regular V Pokemon. You can 1-shot some basics, but that's about it. And then you jump into that VMAX. You only, in air quotes, go to 300 hit points. You do gain free retreat, which is quite nice, but you only gain this max poison wind attack for 2 grass and a colorless once again. Your opponent's active is now poisoned and confused, so 160, again, not great numbers. You can gust and knock out Dedenne GX, but that's just about it. Everything else, you're basically two-shotting. Confusion can be a headache for the opponent, but usually we're, full of switch cards and all that sort of stuff, so I don't think it's going to be phenomenal. You can maybe try and push that poison damage output even further with some mods, but I don't think it's, that influential. You probably need to play Acceleration, either through Rillaboom with Turffield, or even the help of Eggrow, and also potentially a Rose Engine as well could be viable, but the damage output is just so low, doesn't feel like it's worth building around, and on top of all that, it's weak to fire, and there are some exciting things in that category from this set that's going to keep this down, even if it was at all relevant.
Yeah, unfortunately, great art, but I think this is actually one of the worst VMAXs we've seen so far, so Butterfree once again gets a pretty unfortunate card for the TCG. Onto Decidueye, very interesting card actually. Forest Camouflage on the stage 2 grass type prevents all damage done by the attacks of your opponent's V and Pokemon V and Pokemon GX. So it's basically Safeguard for GXs and V Pokemon. Obviously, Safeguard is always very, very relevant when you're thinking about a format. We've seen Safeguard be useful in almost every single format it's been in, to varying successes. And I think in general, this is going to be one of the, at least an interesting puzzle to work out for your deck, how you're going to deal with Decidueye. Decidueye has the very interesting sort of balancing act of, yes, it's a stage 2, but because it's a stage 2, it does benefit from having 140 HP, which actually is a pretty annoying amount of HP to deal with for a variety of one prize Pokemon. So if you are able to get into multiple Decidueyes, even where you would have to have 4 Hoopers plus maybe a couple of rescue stretches and really just try and churn Hoopers out against certain decks, Decidueye, even just that plus 20 HP may be enough to out-resource your opponent, which is really, really interesting. You definitely do pay the price in being a stage 2. You can't just sort of forehead drop this down as you could Hooper, but gaining that little bit of HP, even though, like I say, it is just plus 20, I think is actually very, very relevant. The attack is Split Arrow for 2 energy, does 90 and 20 to 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon. Nothing great, but you are able to set up certain numbers here and there, and it is at least doing a moderate amount of damage, so that you're not just sitting behind a Decidueye sort of wasting time. There's a couple of really interesting things you can do with this. Things like Grovyle and Turffield are going to be the way you're probably going to have to search out if you're not going down a Eggrow route. The Eggrow route is kind of sketchy because you're kind of committing all into finding Decidueye, being happy to find some Decidueyes, but also giving up 3 prizes because the Eggrow is just there for the taking whenever your opponent wants. So whilst it's one of the more consistent ways of searching out the Decidueye, it's also very feast or famine because you're then kind of putting yourself at a 3 prize detriment anyway. So that's pretty interesting. In general, and then of course you do have things like Grovyle and Turffield if you don't go for the Rowegg sort of build. We do have a variety of different ways of, or pretty much every deck has some kind of out to Decidueye, but it's really going to be an interesting puzzle to see whether these decks put enough resources into things like Baby Hooper, things like 1 energy attackers or 1 prize attackers in things like Centiskorch and stuff. I guess Centiskorch is pretty easy because you have Ninetales, but in general, you do have to, bob and weave with your list, and I definitely think you need to keep Decidueye in mind when building. It does also evolve from the Rowlet. We'll talk a little bit more about the Rowlet in general, but the Rowlet isn't completely irrelevant. It does have a usable attack. In general, it's a little bit better in the Sky Circus deck overall. But yeah, Decidueye is one of the most interesting safeguards I think we've ever seen because, like I say, you have that balancing act of, yes, you're a stage 2 and inherently inconsistent, but I really think that plus 20 HP on something like a Hooper is a lot more relevant than people realize because it really can push a lot of resources out of people to maybe have to then take 2 turns to knock out one Decidueye. And at that point, if you're sort of doing 2 shots with Decidueye, but Split Arrow is setting up damage at the same time, you might really struggle in certain situations to deal with 2 or 3 Decidueyes overall. So I think it's definitely going to be an interesting one, and I think Decidueye is definitely something you need to keep in mind, as with all Safeguard. overall, it's not going to be as consistent as certain Safeguard has been in the past, but I think it's definitely going to be one that you have to think about and really have to, especially when going into events, think about whether you want to tech for, because there will be certain decks that just basically auto lose to Decidueye if they don't think about it.
Yeah, I feel like it sort of takes the mantle from Obstagoon as that new sort of like, haha, you can't touch me kind of deck. It's interesting that you picked up on the 140 hit points. One of the first things I tried to do was add in like big charms to this deck, just to make it even more of a push out of range. Let's not forget this can also just be picked up with Scoop Up Nets as well, so potentially adding in Scoop Up Net Jirachi package and then also adding in potentially even energy switches, or just having a Decidueye sat in the active and then one that you're attaching to on the bench, and then you can just Scoop Up Net one whilst they're hitting into of the one prizes. It feels like you will out-resource like a decent number of these decks, even if Eternatus is playing, you know, the Spiritombs and the Hoopers. Hooper is hit for weakness by Decidueye, so you can one-shot them, and those 20 bench snipes can be annoying for the zigzags or for their Spiritombs. It stops them building too much spite to even put them into like knockout range at times. So yeah, it's going to be annoying. That Wind Puddles attack, I actually do play Bird Keepers in my initial list of Decidueye because it's Stellar Wish based anyway. And the fact that you can just like 60 poke maybe some like evolving stuff if they do have like stage 1 techs or something like that, or even putting those beefier basics like into range of a split arrow whilst you're still manually attaching to your other Decidueye that you're building makes a lot of sense to me. So yeah, I think this Decidueye is like relatively threatening. I think fortunately there are those like Center Scorch decks that are probably playing, like you said, Ninetales and a bunch of Baby Volks that already get through this. At least like 4 Hoopers give you a chance against Decidueye if you are playing Eternatus. I feel like there'll be a lot of decks that do struggle though. Like ADPization doesn't have many good go-to options for one prizes anymore, nor does like Luke Metal. Vikavolt doesn't have many great one prize options. Like they may be forced to adding in like Electros if they want to respect this deck, and if they don't, they just lose. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how much of a push this deck actually makes, and I think it more or less goes down to exactly how much Center Scorch is played, because that's just like a natural auto loss that you take as Decidueye. So that's probably one of the bigger headaches right now. But otherwise, it can sometimes just out-resource people. Oh, did you have something else to say on that?
The only thing I was going to say was, an interesting thing about Decidueye as well is the fact that it's one of the first attacking stall options we've had. In the past, people have just put in one Pokemon that can eventually chip through Hoopers, but that doesn't work with Decidueye because Decidueye actually applies pressure back. So I've seen people saying, "Oh, I'm playing ADPization with one Duraludon to get through Decidueye."
It's not going
to work,
Duraludon
right? Will not win you the Decidueye matchup because Decidueye will happily lose 5 prizes because eventually they will kill your one Duraludon and you'll get rid of your one Ordinary Rod, and all of a sudden you still lose the game. So Decidueye applies a lot more pressure, and you can't just think about it as I'll just throw in one card tech. You actually have to run things like 2 to 3 Hooper and 2 to 3 Spiritomb, or maybe even 4 Hooper and stuff like that, just to have enough damage to deal with these Decidueyes. It's definitely not the same as just one card counter will win me the quote-unquote stall matchup. It doesn't work like that. It's actually an attacking threat as well, even though the attack seems somewhat underwhelming. When you can't do anything else, 90 and 220 snipes is pretty scary.
Yeah, I agree. And just one tiny more note that we have on it. It's probably slightly more consistent than Obstagoon was, simply because Turffield can stick for a turn, and the double dip value that you can get on exactly that stadium is really nice. You'll still probably play like the Rosa, Quad Jirachi, that sort of stuff. I think the one prize route is way better than the Eggrow route. I just thought I'd mention Eggrow. If you wanted to tech like a 1-1-1 line of Decidueye just for like a matchup in Eggrow, that's kind of why that was there. But yeah, Decidueye seems slightly more consistent than Obstagoon was, and that managed to see a decent amount of success. Alright, let's talk about the Sky Circus as its own thing in general. It's not only the Rowlet that has this ability, there's 2 other Pokemon in this set that all share the Sky Circus ability, and they all state, if you played a Bird Keeper from your hand during this turn, ignore all energy in the attack costs of this Pokemon. So, let's go over it. The Rowlet does 60 damage to one of your opponent's bench. The Starly does search your deck for any 2 cards and put them into your hand. And the Swanner is the, in air quotes, main attacker that we have here. It's a stage 1 that has 110 hit points and can use Feather Slash, 70. You can discard one from your hand if you do 70 more damage. So, obviously, this is not lighting the world on fire. 140 is the big damaging threat, isn't doing a huge amount. Now, you can still play energies in your deck if you want to. You can play things like Powerful Colorless to maybe buff that a little bit here and there. But even then, like, it's a really low damage cap that you're sat on. 160 puts you in range of Dodenes. A couple Powerful Colorless could put you into a bit more damage, but it's still not looking great. And the fact is, you're having to chain Birdkeeper, and that's going to come with a whole heap of headaches. It really reminds me of the sort of Gathering of Cats deck. It was like a fun rogue, but not much more than that. I feel like Swanna will fit that exact same bill. One of the only kind of benefits is that you can still play 3CE with Swanna, so you can have a turn here and there, like bossing stuff up and using a 3CE for turns. So you probably will play, like, 4 to 6 energies maybe, with a couple Powerful Colorless and a few triple accelerations. But overall, this sort of mini package will more or less just be for fun, I would think.
I think so too. And whilst this has no reflection on the Mad Party stuff we're going to talk about, it also, I think, pseudo hurt by the fact that Mad Party's in this set as well, because Mad Party just seems like a better one prize deck. So it's like it suffers from, if this had come out in a different set, maybe in the set before, this would probably see more experimentation just because it was the new one prize deck on the block. But unfortunately, it looks like Mad Party is taking that mantle, so these also fall shy of that, even though Mad Party doesn't seem overall too good anyway. I think it's also hurt by that existence in this exact set, just because it already has competition. Next up, we have Galissapod, a really, really interesting card, and one that I think people were super hyped about initially. Galissapod is a stage 1 with 130 HP, and the attack we are looking at is Adversity Slash for 2 colorless energy. Notably, we can use Twin Energy. You do 30 damage plus 50 more for each of your opponent's Pokemon V and GX Pokemon in play. So obviously, counting V and GX Pokemon is really, really nice for being able to rack up that damage. At least that was what I think a lot of people first thought. And I think in general, this card will see some experimentation. But I think this card will fairly quickly be relegated back to the binder, more than anything because Adversity Slash really isn't actually that impressive when you think about it. As HPs go up, in general, you need to be doing more damage anyway. Say your opponent has maybe 2 attackers and a Crobat on the board or a Dedenne on the board. Bearing in mind they're going to see a Wimpod at some point, so they're going to know to hold back their V and GX Pokemon anyway. Say they have 2 attackers and even 2 of Crobat or Dedenne, things like that. Adversity Slash is doing 230. That's a pretty impressive number, but it's on a stage 1 that your opponent sees coming, that they almost always will be getting the response KO on because you only have 130 HP. You then need to find another Twin Energy, another Galissapod, presuming you found another Wimpod earlier on, the turn before. So you're already, whilst you're seemingly doing a lot of damage to these GX and V Pokemon, you're definitely running a fairly inconsistent engine. We do have things like Turffield and even things like Piers that we mentioned earlier for finding a couple of these pieces. But overall, it's pretty... I think it's going to be pretty inconsistent trying to really, really push this type of archetype. It's the kind of attacker that I could see in some kind of Twin Energy box deck. This would be the grass-style attacker, as well as just a sort of big hitter for that kind of deck. But the second we lose the second we lose Ditto Prism Star, I should say, this kind of card gets so much weaker because your opponent sees a Wimpod and knows exactly what to do. Overall, I think there will be some experimentation, and I think writing the card off completely would be pretty irresponsible because Adversity Slash can do a lot of damage, especially in a Game 1 scenario, but I think that's all that is. Even in things like Eternatus, where you're thinking they're going to have an 8 Pokemon bench, they're going to have 3 or 4 Crobat out, things like that. Well, to knock out an Eternatus, they need to have 7 V or GX Pokemon out because you need to be doing. If they only have 6, you're doing 330. So base damage, you need 7. Of course, you have ways to supplement the damage, but even at 6, that means they're going to have 2 Eternatus, maybe 2, even 3 Crobat, but they can definitely hold off at that 3rd Crobat. They don't need to put another Pokemon down, especially as you only have 130 HP as well. So even in decks that go really, really wide like Eternatus, they can definitely play around Galissapod. So I think there was a lot of hype around this card, and a lot of people were like, yes, it's the one prize answer to all of these multiple prize Pokemon. And the card definitely has merit. It does a lot of damage, and in a game 1 scenario, could be pretty devastating, but I think in sort of a game 2 and game 3 scenario, this is definitely going to be a lot more underwhelming.
I have to agree. Even with things like Turffield Stadium, it's still a lot of work. Gloom can be your way of forcing things into play, which is quite fun. Flapple could be an extra damage mod, but even then, it's just so bitty right now for the damage. Like Jack said, it's like one piece of the twin box. We're just missing all the other twin attackers that we can even consider playing. So he's just one piece of the puzzle, and we've got to wait for future sets to really kind of realize this card's value. We move on to the Simmies, starting off with Simisage, Simisir, and Simipour. They all are mirrored versions of each other. They all have a 1 energy attack cost that does 30, but the real sort of intrigue is that Giga Impact attack that they all share. For 3 colorless, you do 110, and this Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. So the idea is you can have a triple acceleration, you can hit some decent weaknesses in the game. Sandaconda, if that's going to be an up-and-coming archetype, is weak to grass. Zacian is weak to fire. Probably most people accept that Simisir, if any of them, has the most potential because of that exact Zacian number that you can swing into. And Simipour potentially can hit some like Senti-Scorch Vs, some Victini Vs, Heatran GX, those sorts of cards. But it's just this whole problem of Ditto Prism started going. It was the enabler for these sorts of cards to have that rogue niche one-of play where you can surprise your opponent, smack, and take a 2-for-1 trade. Without that Ditto Prism Star, I could never see these sorts of cards get committed 1 or 2 spaces to their deck to have like that minor swing. And basically nothing's playing triple acceleration at the moment anyway, so extremely niche right now, and kind of been waiting for, again, more support, I would say.
Yeah, I agree completely. Next up, we have Blaziken. We're kicking off with the fire types outside of the couple that we mentioned so far. Blaziken is a pretty interesting stage 2 with the double type ability, very similar to Gallade. This time we are both fire and fighting type. So actually 2 relevant types. Fighting type hitting the Eternatus stuff, and fire type hitting all of the metal stuff, Zacian, things like that. There's actually 2 relevant types, probably 2 more relevant types than Gallade was. But Gallade has seen no play, and I think Blaziken will see little to no play as well. Turbo Drive for 3 energy, does 130 and attaches a basic energy card from your discard pile to one of your bench Pokemon. It's a pretty strong attack, but unfortunately it's on a stage 2, sorry. And because it's on a stage 2, in general, it's so much effort to get this out. It's really, really not that impressive when you eventually do get that benefit of the double type. You do have things like Welder and Twin Energy that both work for this card, and in general, it'll probably be some kind of niche deck that will try and really capitalize on sort of bullying 1 or 2 very specific decks out there. But even in the matchups where it's trying to bully, it's going to be inconsistent. It's a stage 2 with a Welder engine, and Welder engines aren't the most consistent in the best of times. So overall, I think whilst it's a flashy card and is probably an upgrade on Gallade overall, maybe not attack-wise, but definitely types-wise, it's still not going to be good enough because it's just really, really not the time to play stage 2s right now.
Yeah, interesting. I think Gallade actually had more support. It had like Treasure at the time, and it was just 1 Twin Energy, and I think even at the time, its 2 typings were as relevant as Blaziken, because you could one-shot a Pikarom, and with like Diancie, you could one-shot Mewtwo. So I think Gallade hit that sweet spot of like good typing, and Blaziken does exactly the same. But I actually think it's worse for Blaziken because, first of all, it's more energy, so it's more work, but also the fact that you're a fighting type doesn't mean that you one-shot Eternatus. You're still miles away from that one-shot. And you're a fire type, you can deal with like the Zacians and stuff, but even with like the Toughness capes and stuff, they can once again like get out of range. So that's like a real headache for Blaziken. So much work, so slow. ADP Zacian is still going to be a thing, and they can just main the ADP for the most part, and that's going to be terrible for you. So yeah, tons of issues with the Blaziken. Next up, we move on to the Senti-Scorch V and V Max, some of the most hyped cards from this set. The regular Senti-Scorch is a 210 hit point fire type V Pokemon that has Burning Emissions. For 1 fire, you do 20. You can discard an energy from this Pokemon. If you do, you can choose an energy attached to your opponent's active and discard it. in some niche scenarios, this has actually been really helpful, especially for these one attachment per turn kind of decks, like Eternatus, for example. You can catch your opponent like unawares in a way, if they've just sort of attached past into you with their active, thinking they can VMAX and start swinging the next turn. You can sometimes take the tempo away from them with that Burning Emissions, which is something not to be slept on. It also has that Burning Train attack for 4 fire, you do 180. It's expensive, but it's an option if you do miss your VMAX and think it can stick around. But for the most part, we're looking to jump straight into that VMAX, get up to 320 base hit points, and we have the Gmax Sentiferno attack. For 2 colorless, you do 40 plus 40 more for each fire energy attached to this Pokemon, and you can attach a fire energy from your discard pile to this Pokemon after calculating the damage for this attack. What I really like about this card is it's just that 2 energy cost. For so long now, we've seen fire Pokemon have 3, 4, 5 plus energy attack costs, and we just say, it's fine, we can weld it and we can get there. But what I really like about the Centiskorch is, like, even if you're not weldering on certain turns, this is still, 120 base if you're just fulfilling that 2 colorless attack cost. That's enough to deal with, like, those Jirachis and those other single prizes in the early turns. And thanks to you attaching from the discard pile as well, jumping yourself up to 160 the next turn, if your Centiskorch isn't knocked out, you can like welder and reattach, and you can finish things off that you hit for that 120 quite happily. So it feels like even if you're not drawing super well with the Centiskorch, as long as you get into that VMAX, you're still doing a good chunk. He's relatively self-sufficient. You can try and play him towards the tank route, which is adding in those heat fire energies and big charms and having some heal in there as well. Seeing as though you're like self-attaching and all that, you're relatively self-sufficient, you can get away with not weldering every single turn. Or you can go down that aggro route where you are just playing a shed load of welders, trying to play those Poker Gears, Dedenes, just trying to welder as much as possible to ramp up to silly damage output. That's the one that we've tried more often than not, and having Ninetales as that sort of gusting option. It's been interesting so far. It is sometimes, a stage 1 too far, because, trying to jam in Senti and Ninetales and get them both set up in time hasn't always worked out. So it's going to be interesting, the sort of tug of war between this. Maybe in between is the best route, where you just play 1 or 2 regular heat fires, 4 welders, and then 4 or so other supporters in your deck. That could definitely be a way around this. But I do think there are just those situations where you've gone second, you've hit your welder, you've done your Volcanion, and you've put it all onto a Centiskorch, you've put all your eggs in one basket. If the opponent can't gust on exactly turn 2 and knock out your Centiskorch V, you can just run straight over your opponent with a huge Gmax Sentiferno that just gets out of control, and it takes 2 big one-shots, and then your second VMAX can close out the game. Even things like your Heatran GX can close out the game. So Fire still does have a ton of support, and I think Centiskorch VMAX is definitely the most promising Fire VMAX that we've seen over the last couple of sets.
Definitely. The thing that really appeals to me with Centiskorch is the fact that we've seen Welder decks do really, really well. Ability Zard was one of the best decks in the format last year. Even things like Baby Blounce have obviously been super consistent. Both of those decks have been super reliable on Welder. You had to hit Welder in your first 2 turns, otherwise your deck just fell flat. Centiskorch is a Welder deck that doesn't need to hit Welder, but benefits if it does, because you're doing even more damage. So it's like a Welder deck with an added caveat, maybe not consistency, but an added caveat of, well, if you miss Welder, it's actually not the end of the world, because you're able to attack anyway, like you say. It's that nice 2 energy attack cost. You're not reliant on additional acceleration. You're also accelerating yourself, which is obviously nice because you're then threatening 2 shots. But also you're able to save your welders for the late game. Things like Stamp and stuff like that get a lot worse for your opponent if you haven't had to use Welder all early game, because you've actually been able to push yourself to knockouts with Gmax Sentiferno anyway. So yeah, it's really, really interesting. Like I say, I feel like it's definitely a Welder deck that maybe doesn't need to Welder every turn, and that is such a headache for certain Welder decks. So yeah, it's definitely a really, really interesting one. And whilst there's definitely been times, as you've said, that things have all got a little bit too complicated in hand, no, you can't deny how strong the card is. And even if the approach we initially made wasn't the correct approach, I think this is undeniably going to be one of the strongest decks in the format, just because of how efficient it is, as well as having good typing and so much support anyway. Next up, we have a lot more of an underwhelming VMAX, Charizard VMAX. Once again, they've really done Charizard dirty. They really seem to struggle to make Charizards super well anywhere near competitive compared to some of the other fire Pokemon we get. The V has 220 HP, so a pretty fair amount. Has the Claw Swipe attack for 3 energy, doing 80. And then the Fire Spin attack for 4 energy, doing 220. It's actually a pretty efficient attack, in all honesty. And it makes the V Pokemon almost better than the VMAX in certain situations. But overall, we're going to be playing the VMAX anyway, so 330 HP is obviously absolutely monstrous. And Claw Swipe gets bumped up to 100 for 3 energy. Notably, you can play 3 CE for that Claw Swipe now, though, again, you have the Welder engine, so it's going to be pretty... you're going to be pretty reluctant to. Anyway, Gmax Wildfire, however, is doing 300 damage for 5 energy, and you discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. Interestingly, as long as you get 1 attachment on the Charizard turn 1, you can still Gmax Wildfire turn 2 because you can Welder into triple acceleration, so there is ways to actually... again, it's another Welder deck that doesn't necessarily have to hit Welder on the first turn, it can. But that being said, basically... the reason this is so low is because of the exact reasons we've just talked about. Centiskorch, it's just completely outclassed. You get a little bit more HP and you do a little bit more damage overall. But even with Gmax Centinferno, if you have 3 energy in comparison to Claw Swipe, you're doing 20 more damage and are able to then scale your damage more. And you're able to do that for less energy, so you don't need to find a Welder in the early turns. All for basically just having 10 less HP. It really, really makes you wonder why you would play the Charizard VMAX overall. With 5 energy, Gmax Centinferno is going to be doing 240. And yes, that is less than 300, but in general, the difference isn't going to be too phenomenal. You're going to be two-shotting everything with 240 or with 300, and without too much damage modifiers, the 300 isn't really knocking out any VMAXs anyway. So the difference between 240 and 300 is almost negligible, and you have a more consistent early game attacker and one that doesn't require Welder and Centiskorch. So overall, whilst Charizard is obviously very, very flashy, I think that's all that it is, and then it's just come at an unfortunate time where Centiskorch is just in the same set and therefore outshines it. It's another case of maybe if Centiskorch had come a set later or Zard a set earlier, it would have seen a bit more play because it wouldn't have been competing so hard with another archetype that is just strictly better. But unfortunately for Zard, I think the fact that Centiskorch is in the exact same set as it means that this is going to see very, very minimal play outside of people just wanting to play Zard for the sake of playing Zard.
Mm-hmm. It's got really awkward numbers. The 100's not great in many situations. The 300, as you said, is just like wasted damage, or it's still not enough to reach other VMAXs. So it's really weird to say that 300 is a bad number for 5. So it's just too expensive and too much work. I remember trying Welder with the Cinderace and the Snorlax, and the Charizard is just more work than those combined, and I found it hard enough to get those VMAX lists working. So I really do think it's an uphill battle for the Charizard, especially when Centiskorch is clearly able to function on a lot less and continue to be in the game for the most part. We move on to Houndoom V. It's a 210 hit point basic fire that has the Searing Flame attack. For 1 fire, you do 20 and burn the opponent's active, so it's a guaranteed 40. And you also have the Compensation Flame for 2 fire and 1 colorless. You can do 100, plus if any of your fire Pokemon have damage counters on them, you do 100 more damage. Really reminds me of the Berserk attack that we saw from Drampa GX way back when. It's a little bit awkward, this Houndoom V, because although you are just a Welder and an attachment into this guy, you also need to probably synergize with, starting a fire Pokemon, or at the very least switching into something and jinxing onto another fire Pokemon. So you need to find Welder, you need to find another backup fire basic and a jinx. That's like a lot of ball search in your opening turns. You need to find Spikemuth like immediately, and you need to Welder. That's like so many moving pieces. So it's not necessarily easy to get straight into that 200 damage, but that's what you got to do if you're going to try and build around Houndoom. The kind of upsides is you can try and make him kind of chunkier with those the cape or the toughness cape, and with the special fire energy, you can try and make him kind of bulky as a 2-prizer. His type coverage is still very decent, especially if we're going to see like Zamazenta, Luke Metal type tanky builds, because from our testing that's been one of the best ways to just beat Eternatus. So Houndoom could be just kind of the fly in the ointment. It's kind of sitting in the middle ground. Could also be awkward for Center Scorch, because you're a 2-prizer that forces them to draw like all the good stuff, because you can, again, with those capes, you can push yourself into an annoying damage range. So he could just be decent enough to just trade into these 3-prize decks, just because the tempo can be good. But it really does require you to draw like quite well, because you need to find Stadium first, find your switch cards, find your Jinx more often than not, find your Welder on top of that, and get into your Houndoom. So it's a lot of work. That's why I rated it fairly low, but the tempo is still there, so we have to give it a little bit of credit for experimentation.
Definitely. I keep comparing this card to exactly Drampa GX, like you've added to the slide, and compare this to like a Drampa Garb style deck. At the time, Drampa doing 150 plus with the choice band 180 was way more relevant than just doing 200. You can see that 180 was a relevant number by the fact that Drampa could KO itself, whereas Houndoom can't KO itself. Yes, we have things like Vitality Band and the Galarian Zigzagoon, but in general, like you say, it's just more moving pieces. And later on in the game, Drampa had Garbodor for the GX Pokemon that it couldn't take early prizes on. Drampa was the really super high pressure early game option, and in the late game you had Garbodor using Trash Launch to try and take out these bigger Pokemon. You've devoted so much space to trying to get these moving parts for the Houndoom to work, which you didn't need to do for the Drampa because you needed so much less. You actually don't have space for a supplementary attacker now to be able to deal with the fact that you have to 2-shot through things like Eternatus, which is just going to be one-shotting you super consistently back. So it's definitely a really weird sort of comparison to make when it looks so similar to Drampa, but actually because of the amount of work you have to put in to get that early game tempo that Drampa had, you don't have the late game reliability of something like a Garb to be able to deal with other threats in the format that Houndoom can't deal with. And in general, it's just it's more work for a worse effect that you can't really you really need to punish people in the early turns with this. If you don't win by turn 3 or 4, you're really going to start to sort of fall off overall. So yeah, it's a really weird one. I thought initially when the card was released, I was like, wow, it's a good Houndoom finally. This actually looks really strong. But the more we tested it, the less consistent it seemed. And even if you do get that consistent turn 2 200 with Compensation Flame, even turn 2, yeah, turn 1 to 2 and turn 2 Compensation Flame, the deck didn't have enough legs in the late game to be able to compete anyway. So yeah, it was like you were putting all of your eggs into one basket to then losing the late game anyway. So it's another case of why not just play Center Scorch and be the better Welder deck. Next up, we have Milotic onto the Water Pokemon, and this is unfortunately a 1-star Pokemon. Bright Heal has the ability, once during your turn, you may heal 20 damage from each of your Pokemon. Pretty relevant for things like Dragapult and Galarian Zigzagoon being sort of in the format, but overall, you're running a stage 1. Your opponent can just place a lot of damage counters on one thing, so you're just getting a heal 20. And in general, heal 20 is probably not really going to be helping you overall in terms of 1, staying out of 2-shot range, or 2, staying, if you're getting 1 shot, you can't use it anyway. So it's like a really weak ability that seems very nice with how prevalent, especially Galarian Zigzagoon seems to be getting, becoming a 3 to 4 of in the best deck in format, with 3 to 4 scoop up nets as well. So you're going to be having a lot of counters on your board, but at the same time, you're to play a stage 1 to try and get around that. It's another sort of hit in the Ditto Prism Star camp. It's just this card will never be good enough while there isn't a consistent way to not have this clunk up your deck. So yeah, it's unfortunate that it's not great, but one huge merit of this line is the fantastic Feebas art that me and Joe absolutely love. Just lost in the middle of a lake. That personally is my favorite part about these cards, is they look absolutely gorgeous, but unfortunately, practically, they're not going to be too useful.
Yeah, I wanted to put the Feebas on here for the art, firstly, but also just because it kind of renders Milotic useless in the first place, because the things you're trying to counter, Feebas is so vulnerable to. So if you don't Milotic on 2, you'll just get punished for even putting this in your deck in the first place, because Zigzagoon Net can kill this, and Dragapult can kill this, so the fact that Feebas is so weak makes it even more of a risk than a reward most of the time. We move on to the Mad Party shenanigans. There's 4 Mad Party Pokemon in this set, and the Mad Party attack does 20, times the number of Pokemon in your discard pile with that Mad Party attack. The main attackers that we're going to look for here is the Bunnelby. It's a 40 hit point colorless Pokemon that can just use it off of a twin energy. There's a Dedenne that has a Psychic and 2 colorless, which is a little bit awkward to get going. The Poltegeist, probably the backup attacker if you are going to go all in on the Mad Party. And that also has that 2 colors attack cost, so you can use twin, but you can also add in triple accelerations into your deck if you want to. Poltegeist also has the T-Break ability, meaning that this may not just be discard fodder. You may want to evolve it from a Sinistea so that you can use, once during your turn, you can discard a Pokemon with Mad Party from your hand to draw 2 cards. So it's a trade style effect or a make-do effect with exactly these Mad Partiers. And let's not forget, you will be playing 16 in your deck because you'll want to max out copies of all of these to increase your damage output. So it's got reasonable odds of being live to draw yourself some extra cards. But do bear in mind, the Sinestees are very fragile again to those zigzag net combos for easy prizes for the opponent. And Eternatus will be playing quad zigzag, quad scoop up net almost always, I would say. And if they are even playing things like Candy Zigzagoon, that could be just awful for Sinistea because it's so fragile. Same thing could be said for the Bunnelby. And even the Poltergeist is very fragile. The final one is Galarian Mr. Rime, also one that you probably won't want to evolve into. Its ability isn't all that relevant right now because Jirachi Prism is rotating, and its attack cost is water and 2 colors, which is also quite expensive. So the long and short of it is the Dene and Mr. Rime are the sort of discard fodder. Bunnelby and Poltergeist are a mixture of discard fodder and attackers, and Poltergeist can potentially be your engine. Let's not get it twisted. This is not as good as Night March. The 20 times is far less good now that we are kind of like doubling the HP of the Night March era. Yes, we have more physical Mad Partiers, but that just means more space in your deck gets taken up in the first place. So you can't be quite as consistent as the old Night March. And the hit points on these guys is so like glass cannon. Especially when we have those zigzag net combos. We have Dragapult still maybe around, Salamence potentially being around. So many things can punish the low hit points of these cards. We have plenty of discard synergy, so that's probably not the biggest worry. We have a ton of Ball Search, we have the new Lookalike Bell, we have Dedenne, you have Hapu, you have Research, so there's a lot of dumping you can be doing in the deck, but man, taking up 16 slots does take its toll, especially because you probably also need to chuck in like, you know, probably 10 Ball Search cards as well, minimum, and then like 3 Dedennes, and then your Researchers and Hapus and stuff. It eats up like all the space immediately, so you don't really have any space for really any tricks, I would say. You're all in on the Mad Party, and it's basically, you know, the first 1 or 2 turns can be very, very poor damage, and then it's only really in like the relative late game where you're getting into that sort of 200 range, and you know, 200 to 240 isn't really blowing me away by like turn 4. You know, that's not really great. So you can see the community are slightly more excited about this archetype just because it does hark back to the Lost Marches and the Night Marches, but this feels like it's still going to be a little bit below the bar, even though it does have that mini draw engine going on for it. Obviously, as well, you can scoop up net your Poltergeist, so once you've used those T-breaks, you can pick them up and then just discard them from some of your other synergy cards. So they're not necessarily like taking away from your damage output, but I still think that damage output just doesn't quite get there as we move towards the VMAX generation, I would say.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. In the Night March days, 180 was genuinely the most damage you needed to do, which was easy for Night March because you just needed 9 in the discard, and you had an extra 3 as attackers. Well, now if you have 15 in the discard, you're still not one-shotting an Eternatus, and you only have 1 attacker left. So, you know, you can see that the damage has not scaled with the HP quite well enough. There will be people that champion this deck. There were people that champion Night March all the way through, even though Night March was good the whole way through. But there are also people that championed Lost March all the way through, and Lost March was pretty underwhelming for the majority of its time in Standard. There are a couple of highlight reel, very, very good performances, but overall, there are still people playing Lost March today when the deck is like beyond dead. So there will be people that champion Mad Party, from the day it comes out until the day it rotates, but it's just nowhere near as good as Night March, or even Lost March was, to be honest. I even think Lost March might have been potentially stronger than this in the format it was in. But yeah, it's definitely interesting, and will always be an archetype to build and try try to see whether you can make it work. And in all honesty, Night March was a deck that just got better and better the more random different cards that happened to help it came along. And despite the deck building issues of this, the fact that you have to run an extra 4 attackers and such, there is definitely potential for this kind of deck to be to get better and better. Interestingly, before they released an extra Lost Marcher, like a year after Lost March was ever going to be was released, makes me think it's not off the cards that we don't ever see another Mad Partier, and maybe it just needs one more Mad Partier to be able to have enough attackers to be able to bin enough. So I wouldn't write the deck off forever. It doesn't mean it's going to be terrible forever. It doesn't mean it won't ever reach Night March standards, but right now it definitely does not. It pales in comparison to how Night March used to be. Next up we have Relicanth, another pretty underwhelming Pokemon. Relicanth has the Fossil Search attack that lets you search your deck for up to 2 rare fossil cards and put them onto your bench. As you can see, we've added the 4 different fossils that you can evolve into, and we'll be going over those sooner rather than later. And these cool family effects aren't terrible, but when you're just searching for fossils, it's not great. You're immediately putting yourself in sort of range of a couple of pretty awkward things. Well, a couple of pretty awkward things in general for deck building, just because the fossils aren't great anyway. But also, there's not much flexibility to it. You have 2 rare fossils, whereas things like Call for Family can search for tech attackers. They can search for support, consistency. It's not as sort of free reign as a Call for Family style attack, because Fossil Search can only search for fossils, which can then only evolve into the fossils that you're playing. So, whilst that's a bit of a niche sort of downside, it's actually a very relevant one. And yeah, in general, just because the sort of fossil mechanic is so weak, it's never going to be groundbreaking. Things like greens and bills and Jirachi are just going to be more consistent ways of finding your fossils, as well as finding other pieces in the turns you don't need to find your fossils. So in general, I think I'd rather just have Jirachis in my deck than Relicanths and be able to stamp proof myself.
Hello? You still here, Jack? Oh no, is he disconnected? Okay. Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, carry on.
I'm here, okay. Yeah, basically all I was saying was the fossil mechanic is so weak that I think you need Jirachi as supplement anyway to be able to make your deck consistent. So I want Jirachis in my active spot as much as I can to be able to Stellar Wish and find answers for situations that lead on from the inconsistencies of a fossil deck anyway. So I don't think Relicanth gives much to the deck outside of, I guess, more basics to play. But yeah, I feel like Jirachi is always way more optimal.
Yeah, like I was just thinking maybe if the rare fossils were worth evolving into, this could be like a 2 count in addition to Jirachis, but first of all, you're taking away attachments that could go onto your rare fossils that you probably want to do anyway on turn 1 if you're looking to attack with any of these. But also, like you say, it's just not very versatile, and you're normally just trying to like Stellar Wish towards your rare fossils anyway, and that's probably going to be more beneficial in the long run. On to Suicune now. I don't think this is like an excellent one-prize Pokemon, but I did want to sort of touch on the power of Phosmoth and how it's going to adapt in the new meta. So the Suicune itself, just quickly, 120 hit point basic Pokemon with a Wave Splash, 1 for 20, and Aurora Loop for 2 water and a colorless, you do 130, and you can return 2 water from this Pokemon to your hand. It has a little bit of nice synergy where you're not really giving up too much if he is going to just get knocked out immediately, because you can then just re-Ice Stance onto new Pokemon. But in general, I think Frosmoth looks a lot more exciting in the new set. Snom having 50 hit points was a big limiting factor when Dragapult was like running rampant around the game. Also, Pikarom being a lightning Pokemon and also hugely prevalent meant that most of the VMAXs couldn't really have time in the limelight. But I do feel like those things are kind of both deteriorating a little bit, and other decks are going to be more in the top tier. So we might finally start seeing some Ice Dance shenanigans in the format. In addition to that, Keldio's GX attack, Resolute Blade, gets like way stronger in this format with Eternatus. So maybe playing some tankier water stuff, making Eternatus commit to their bench, and then hitting them with a Resolute Blade out of nowhere could be like a big deal. Even just like regular Keldeo V with like Toughness Cape can be more worth committing towards, because potentially it has more time to tank. So I think Frostmoth might be worth looking into. Suicune could be a one-prize Pokemon in that deck, because they are kind of missing that with Volt Prism rotating. But I still think the Suicune is probably like a little bit below the bar, and I'd look towards other stuff with the Moth. But I thought this slide was basically exactly here to tell you that Frostmoth might start seeing a little bit more play, and it's going to be less obscure, because Stage 1 Rain Dance is still broken, just inherently. We just haven't been able to unlock that door just yet.
Excellent. Next up we have Vanillux. Vanillux is another Stage 2 with the Freezing Cold ability. Once during your turn, if this Pokemon is your active Pokemon, you may flip a coin. If heads, your opponent's active Pokemon is now paralyzed. Pretty annoying, and in general, paralysis is obviously the most difficult status condition to deal with. We do have a variety of different ways of being able to get out of status conditions, things like Switch and Scoop Up Net. That's why we've included the Air Balloon and the Vikavolt. Basically, you can Freezing Cold, then Air Balloon, Free Retreat into Vikavolt and Item Lock, so things like Scoop Up Net and Switch are no longer active. Obviously, that sounds peachy in a world where Vanillux was maybe a basic, but it's a Stage 2, and that's, again, just the inherent weakness of the card. Even how good Paralysis is, it's not worth the Stage 2 sort of downside, and overall, having to be in the active spot actually is pretty annoying at the same time, because you don't really want to... You then have to find a way of, if you've been using Paralyzing Bolt in the early turns with your Vikavolt to try and slow your opponent down to be able to build into Vanillux, you then need to find a way of moving the Vanillux. So yeah, it's all just a little bit more convoluted than maybe you would want to play this kind of Vikavolt deck, and I think in general Vikavolt just wants to play something way more consistent than trying to jam in a Stage 2 line when it, more than anything, just wants to be Paralyzing Bolt as consistently as possible on turn 1. All of these Stage 2 pieces are just going to be too clunky in the early turns for it to actually be beneficial.
Yeah, I just wanted to give this a quick note, really, because Dustox was a kind of like random rogue for trapping and just sometimes not even attacking at all, but you just continuously paralock people, and I wanted to give some nod towards that because people will try this, but it's a Stage 2 that still has to flip a coin and be active. That's like a lot of steps, so yeah, definitely on the weaker side. We then come to Dracovish in a bit more detail. We're not going to talk about all of the fossil Pokemon, but Dracovish seems to be a little bit more interesting than the others, but we still are going to rate it that 1 star. It's a 150 hit point Stage 1, which would be good if it didn't evolve from a fossil, and it has Primal Law. If this Pokemon is your active, your opponent can't play any Pokemon from their hand to evolve their Pokemon. Its only attack is Hammer In for a Water and 2 colorless, and you do 120. You're also weak to lightning, which isn't ideal when Vikavolt's potentially around. Vikavolt in general just like completely bodies any fossil archetype because you can't rare fossil throughout the game. But this Dracovish ability kind of harps back to Archeops. The bigger issue here is that Dracovish has to be active, and most decks are playing boss in at least a 2 count, sometimes with Eldegoss, sometimes just higher count in general, sometimes Mewtwo Scoopnet. So people are going to find their way around this Primal Law, and as soon as they do, like, Hammer In isn't doing enough damage to compete on its own. This has a 3 retreat cost, so you can't Air Balloon it, so it's not really a good hit and hide kind of Pokemon that you can just put in the way for people. And also, you know, people can evolve even before you do. So all of these things make me think this is very, very poor. There's a handful of these decks that just have enough, you know, basic Pokemon that can get through a Dracovish 1v1 anyway, because its attack cost is still expensive, so you might even need to play Frostmoth or something like that. So many steps, and there's just not enough reward there, I think, because too many people will get around this soft lock.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Onto the lightning types, and it is indeed Vikavolt V as the first one we're going to be talking about. 210 HP basic V Pokemon with the first attack Paralyzing Bolt. For 2 energy, a lightning and a colorless, you can do 50 damage and prevent your opponent from playing item cards from their hand during your next turn. Obviously, immediately harks back to something like a Seismitoad EX, which was absolutely crippling for the meta. It basically ruled the meta it was in for 3 years. It was crazy how strong that card was. Unfortunately, Vikavolt is not that strong because of the slightly more awkward attack cost. That being said, we do have things like Coco and Turbo Patch to try and supplement that, so that's definitely worth noting. Things like Toughness can make this card pretty tanky, which is scary. And obviously you've got Team Yell Grunts, Crushing Hammers, all of the standard kind of disruption things on top of item lock to really try and prevent your opponent to do anything. One of the best, sort of scariest things you can do with Vikavolt is actually dropping down a Galamine, bossing up something like a Dedenne or a Crobat, and trapping that active with the Paralyzing Bolt. Obviously, it's a little bit worse against things like Eternatus, which can just attach a hide energy. But that's one of the only decks that really has a very, very good out to being able to avoid getting Galamine trapped. So that's probably one of the best things to lean into with Vikavolt V. And obviously, there's still a wide variety of lightning attackers you can play to try and supplement the Vikavolt as well in the later game, where you just want to then take some prizes quickly based on after you've taken maybe your first 2 or 3 prizes just through Paralyzing Bolt. Also has the second attack, Super Zap Ganon, for 3 energy, doing 190, which is just a nice attack to finish stuff off with. So yeah, in general, obviously nowhere near as strong as Quaking Punch, and I think to no one's surprise. But that being said, item lock is still item lock and is always worth thinking about when it's in the format. We still have a fair amount of disruption, even though we lose a lot of the control options from during rotation. We still have things like Hammers and Yell Grunts, as well as Galamine, which never really saw the play that I think a lot of people expected. Well, maybe this is the deck for that very card. Vikavolt is definitely set to shape some amount of the meta. It won't be a 5-star card like Toad was, just because it's nowhere near as splashable as Toad, it's nowhere near as consistent as Toad. You are still going to need to find your one of Coco or flip a heads on a turbo patch to get that turn 1 Paralyzing Bolt, whereas you just needed a DCE before. But that being said, Paralyzing Bolt, well, item lock in general, is still obviously incredibly strong, and I really think you can't underestimate how little you can do under item lock. And in combination with things like Toughness Cape and Galamine, it's actually going to make Vikavolt really, really difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I agree. I'm relatively excited for this card. I've kind of flip-flopped a few times, and I think it kind of weighs on a few factors. It depends on like how much Malolana sees played, because that's a lot of undone damage. How much Birdkeeper sees players attack. Even things like the Piers count in Eternatus, because if they just still get there under item lock, it's going to be like such a headache, because you kind of just get blown back by them, and the next thing you can do is like trap and kind of like bide your time and hope that Hammers can like slow them down. But if not, and if they're still able to, like keep a Viridian in play or something even, just to continue attaching for a couple turns, that can be really, really rough, because it's so long for you to actually like take those prizes. I don't think a quad Vikavolt is necessarily going to be the right way. I'm more inclined to think that like a Vikavolt Coco kind of deck can work, where you're taking these sort of like almost off turns, like in between Thunderous Bolts, where you're trying to stamp and try and get that little prod in and sort of set things up. Maybe you are still playing those boss Galamine combos, but always with some Coco in the back so that you can actually finish things off. Also, the Super Zap Cannon can be a finishing move as well. So I think it's reasonable. I am kind of worried that there's already things like Welder that can get around trapping options, because they can just Welder and start smacking, and then you're kind of like 1v1ing where you're only doing 50 damage. Yes, you can play healing on your own end, obviously, but they could Welder just to retreat into other stuff as well if it's Center Scorch. And as you said, you can just increase your hide energy count to 4, for example, and suddenly you can get out of all sorts of traps that the Vikavolt player can do. So even with that 260 hit points, I think you are slightly fragile, and that's what put me off jumping this up to the 5-star, as well as the fact that you're relying on Turbo Patch at times. But let's not forget, Pikarom was able to get 3 energies into play at like a 60+% on turn 1 by the end of the format where we were playing it in. So I can foresee it being relatively consistent to get that Paralyzing Bolt off quickly, even without the Thunder Mountain. So I think the speed of the lock is going to be good. I think this card will be extremely strong for Baby Blounds matchups, Spiritomb matchups, setup matchups of all sorts as well. So it's certainly going to have its place. It could be a bit part player in a more Lightning Box-esque kind of deck, or it could be more control focused, and it's down to testing to see which is going to be the one that's most prevalent. Next up we have Toxtricity. It's a stage 1 lightning type Pokemon with 120 hit points. Has the Risk Taker attack for 2 colorless. You flip a coin. If heads, discard the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck. If tails, discard the top 5 cards of your deck. Certainly a big risk. The Thunder Jolt is an attack that we're not really talking about here because it's too expensive and not enough damage, but it's all really about flipping that coin and trying to mill 5 from the opponent. We have a lot of proactive mill cards still, even post-rotation. We have Curse Shovel, and we have Surge Belelba still in the format, so trying to combine that Glimwood Tangle and Twin Energy and just take those big risks. Potentially you can be milling a large chunk of cards from your opponent's deck proactively. And I think with the losses of like Mareep for the Sleep package and Orangaroo to get your own resources back, I feel like a passive mill approach is a lot less likely, and things like Toxtricity and even the Palisand kind of deck may be the operative way to go if you actually want to take this alternative win condition. My biggest headaches with Toxtricity is that you can only play like those twins and those triple accelerations, and you have to have enough draw power to get into those each turn. You have to have enough draw power to get into your next Toxtricity, your next Toxel. Also, you need to maintain a Glimwood Tangle throughout the entire game. And if people are just playing, you know, like 1 or 2 Chaotic Swell, there's 1 or 2 chaotic turns where you're literally flipping that coin, and self-milling 5 can be hugely detrimental if you're hitting key pieces like the Twin Energies, your Pokemon Recovery cards, even things like your Belelbas or your Palpads. That could be a big problem for you. It could end up ruining the game. You could even mill future Glimwood Tangles, for example. So I think this is genuinely a risk. Even though you have Glimwood Tangle, you can sometimes have an unlucky turn and self-mill 5, and that can be enough. That will be game-losing, I imagine, more often than not. As long as you like have a risk taker that goes wrong, I think like once in a game, that might be enough to just lose you the game outright. So certainly on the fun side, but it will be a lot of combo pieces needed every single turn, so you're still probably going to need to be Cincino based for the most part. And when you are Cincino based, there's a little bit of risk to using your own Belelbas, because you could have to be careful about self mill when you don't have that same amount of recycle. Now you can still play Ordinary Rods, you can still play Palpads to give yourself some buffer, but there is still that small headache there. So certainly want to test out. I was super impressed or uninspired by the Palisand Curse Shovel thing from the last set, and it feels like we're kind of just rebuilding it with a Glimwood Tangle and hoping for the best. So I don't feel like it's going to be that much stronger, but the fact of the matter is Mill had better options previously, and all of those rotate now, so it might be the best that we have for this approach.
For sure. Next up we have the other fossil we're going to talk about, Arctozolt. Arctozolt has 130 HP on a stage 1, and has the Knowing Vortex ability. Whenever your opponent attaches an energy from their hand, one of their Pokemon, put 2 damage counters on that Pokemon. In general, it's actually a pretty annoying ability, but again falls short because of the rare fossil engine. We've had a lot of damage counters in the format anyway. We have Flapple plus Turffield that's never ever seen play, and we have Zigzagoon and Scoop Up Net, which has obviously seen way more play, but is a lot more flexible and will continue to be more flexible. With a couple of these out, you can actually do some pretty stupid things, but it's just unfortunate that basically it's going to be very, very difficult to get multiple of these out overall, just because the fossil mechanic is so weak in general. You can do, like I say, you can do some pretty stupid things against things like Welder decks. If you have 3 of these out and your opponent Welders, they deal 120 damage to themselves. That's actually a pretty funny effect, but overall, the amount of resources you put in to getting that kind of effect just isn't anywhere near strong enough. And since we have such good sniping options with Zigzagoon Scoop Up Net anyway, it basically means this card is almost irrelevant, because we can just place the counters exactly where and when we want them, rather than just having sort of a flat ability to do it for us.
Yeah, and I know you just trashed Flapple, but Dragapult's going, man. It's the era of Flapple. I'm telling you it's time. Alright, we move on to the psychic stuff. We have a tech Pokemon in Mimikyu, 70 hit point psychic type, with the ability Heal Stop. The main point here, your opponent's bench Pokemon can't be healed. And the effect of Malolana is to switch and then heal. So this Mimikyu turns off exactly Malolana. You are a 1-card counter to this one supporter that we have in the game. I don't think there's any other bench heal effects right now. Maybe that Milotic or something like that. But that's really about it. So similar to Mr. Mime, it may find its way into one of these decks that doesn't have 1-hit KO potential and otherwise is very hurt by Malolana. the only real one that comes to mind, unfortunately, is Dragapult. And Dragapult seems a lot weaker in this format, so I can't foresee many other decks committing a bench space to this card, or there aren't even that many decks that are so hurt by Malolana that they need to add this in the first place, so it feels a little bit weaker even than Mr. Mime for scoop-up blocking, because trapping your opponent's stuff on their bench can be equally as good, because that's oftentimes the main way people are healing off, like zigzag pokes and a few other things here and there. So it kind of has to pull rank against some of these other one-prize tech ability Pokemon, and I don't think it quite does that right now. So we're going to give it the 1 star, because we don't foresee Malolana being hugely playable, although a quick caveat to that, if Vikavolt is huge, more Malolana will be played. So that's a little thing to bear in mind. Maybe this is a tech card in Vikavolt, so yeah.
Exactly. Next up we have Mew V from the, I think it's the latest sort of round of Japanese decks. Mew V is a 180 HP basic Pokemon with the X-Ball attack for 2 Psychic Energy, doing 30 damage times the number of energy between you and your opponent's active Pokemon. In general, we don't have that great of a support for Psychic Acceleration now that Malamar is going. We have Turbo Patch, and that's about it. So we can't really burst this out of nowhere, which is a little bit awkward. And in general, that kind of effect is just nowhere near as strong right now anyway. Victini has the exact same effect and was fairly strong, but 1, you could burst the energy on quite literally in a turn with Welder. 2, you were a better type because you were able to one-shot Zacians for 2 energy if they just attacked you without a frying pan. And 3, had a Spreading Flames attack, which is actually really, really relevant in the early turns if you missed Welder. So in general, whilst these cards have the exact same effect, Victini V was just way better at doing what it did. And unfortunately, it means that Mew V just falls short, even though they, like I say, they have the exact same text and one saw, a fairly decent amount of placements in various decks. Unfortunately, Mew will not see that same kind of treatment.
We go on to the fighting stuff now with a stage 2 in Flygon. It's a fighting type with 150 hit points, obviously a stage 2. Sand Maze is the ability. If this Pokemon is your active, your opponent's active can't retreat. So again, your opponent can boss his orders around this, annoyingly. But the whole idea is you can try and trap things with your own bosses, your own Galamines, maybe even have things like Omastar as your bench ability to stop them using switches and scoop-up nets. So yeah, you're just trying to, over and over again, stop them from doing stuff and make something chunky sit there. So that's kind of the idea. Desert Geyser for fighting in 2 colors does 130, and if your opponent has a stadium, you can discard it, and then this can't be damaged or affected by any of your opponent's attacks during your opponent's next turn. It really does remind me of the old Rising Rivals Flygon, but just done in a horrible rendition. So it feels like it's a harp back to that, almost like a nod to the old Flygon. Old Stalgon lists were excellent. This one is like so far away from that. So yeah, extremely rogue, extremely niche. We're looking to build a couple stage 2s to even have a viable win condition, and even then it's kind of foiled by a boss anyway. So yeah, sounds really bad to me.
For sure. Next up we have Rhyperior V, another pretty underwhelming V Pokemon overall. 230 HP, it's obviously on the higher side for some of these V Pokemon. First attack being Drill Run for 3 energy, fighting in 2 colorless, does 80 damage, and you discard 1 energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. Guaranteed discard is obviously great, and in general it does look like the format will be a bit of a 2-turn attach meta. So that kind of effect is really, really good. Unfortunately, because it's 3 energy though, you're not going to be able to do this on a turn where it's particularly punishing. To do this on turn 2 means your opponent will already have 1 energy attachment on them, and you need to build a stage 2 up in order to do that anyway. So it's not particularly ideal. And Heavy Rock Cannon for 4 energy does 210, and your opponent can't use, but you can't use this attack during your next turn. So 2 fine attacks, but in general 2 attacks that are just pretty much outclassed by Sandaconda V. If there's going to be a fighting deck to come out of the woodwork to try and deal with Eternatus, we feel like Sandaconda basically outclasses Rhyperior in almost every way. You have early acceleration, so you're nowhere near as reliant on the Colossal in general, and you do 10 more damage for 1 less energy, which you really don't mind because by the time you're using Sand Breath for 220, you're going to have a colossal setup anyway. So the discarding 2 energy from this Pokemon is not really a detriment. So in general, Rhyperior just suffers from being outclassed by a Pokemon we already have that hasn't seen much play anyway. And whilst this type definitely looks to be getting better, I think the only way this will be getting the only way fighting will be seeing players with Sandaconda over Rhyperior anyway.
We go on to the dark stuff. Some of the most interesting stuff from this set for sure, but not this Hydreigon. It's a stage 2 dark type, 160 hit point with the Dark Squall ability. As often as you like during a turn, you may attach a dark energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon. Rain Dance on a stage 2. I think just when I was talking about Suicune earlier on, we've been struggling to make stage 1 acceleration work in an Ice Dance form, and that even had Capacious Bucket. Dark has none of that sort of support, and I even think, you know, the things this can combine with is a sorry sight, to be honest. Like, Greninja Zoroark needs an unholy amount of energies in play to do relevant damage. Guzzlord, yes, it's a good one-prize Pokemon, but even that's expensive. Grimmsnarl VMAX, we're not going to be very complimentary about that card either. It's only capped out at 270, and that's for 5 energy, and that requires you to have a stage 1 and a stage 2 in play. So the Hydreigon is a lot of work. We don't have any good synergistic cards for getting dark energies out of the deck or out of the discard pile in particular, and none of our attackers are all that flattering. So all of that leads to me saying that Hydreigon will be a 1-star because it's been a long time since we've seen very successful stage 2 Rain Dance.
Yeah. Onto the Grimmsnarl V and VMAX in general. The Grimmsnarl V is a 220 HP basic dark Pokemon with Dark Bite as the first attack, 1 for 40, and Spiky Knuckle, 3 dark energy for 200, and you return 2 dark energy from this Pokemon to your hand. Bearing in mind, we don't have great dark acceleration because Hydreigon is a stage 2, as we've just said, and the Weavile engine has never been particularly successful overall, so returning 2 energy to your hand is actually pretty difficult to deal with because it's kind of hard to attach 2 energy back up for that Gmax drill on the VMAX anyway, so even that first attack isn't particularly synergistic. Yes, 3 for 200 is a pretty nice number, but in general you might actually end up then whiffing the next turn and being able to do nothing and really not capitalizing on the tempo you gain for doing 3 for 200, so not a great V Pokemon. And the VMAX unfortunately suffers from a pretty similar fate. 330 HP, Gmax drill for 3, Dark Energy does 170 and does 50 more for each extra Dark Energy attached to this Pokemon in addition to this attack's cost. Great, except that you can only add 100 damage in this way. Now, already, if they didn't have this cap, you would have had to do 300. You would have had to have 6 energy on in order to do 320 damage, which wouldn't have been knocking out some of the Gmaxes in the format, the Vmaxes in the format. So already, this is not doing enough, even with 6 energy. You're now only allowed to attach 5, which means you're capping at 270, which means you're literally not ever knocking out a Vmax without prior damage, and you're not even knocking out some tag teams in the format for 5 energy. I think that's all I need to say. It's just, I don't know why they added this cap on. They didn't need to add this cap on. Even if they didn't add the cap on, the card would still be statistically worse, in my opinion, than Charizard VMAX, which is a sorry sight anyway. So I just don't know why they butchered Grimmsnarl so much. Yeah, I don't have much else to say about it. It's really, really unfortunate that they just, for some reason, added this pseudo cap to a card that probably would have still been a 1-star even if it didn't have this last line of text.
To top it all off, Eternatus is in the set.
Oh, yeah.
Alright, we move on to Ariados. It's a stage 1 dark type that has 110 hit points, and it has the Spider Net ability. When you play this card from your hand to evolve onto your Pokemon, you may switch one of your opponent's evolution Pokemon with their active. So basically, if Eternatus hasn't finished off a VMAX, that's essentially what I'm thinking here. You can just sort of like drag it up with Ariados, and you can use Dread End to knock them out. Eternatus is obviously looking for dark type friends, and this could be an interesting one. It could also be nice for dealing with those Sandaconda Colossal decks, where you can pick off the Colossal after a Sandaconda has like removed energy from itself, and maybe you could like give yourself some respite for a turn. So there's a couple niches here. It's nice to have something you can just sort of put into play so you're less reliant on boss, maybe this could take up a 1/1 space in Eternatus. That's why we gave it that 2-star for the sort of maybe question mark around that sort of play, where it's no more than a 1/1 in here if you want to experiment with it, but it could have a small niche there. For the most part, we imagine that just playing a ton of Zigzags, a ton of Crobats, and probably some like Hoopers or Spiritombs are going to be the best route. But the Gyarados does have a neat ability that was worth talking about, seeing as though Eternatus is always looking for potential partners.
Yeah, definitely. Galarian Slowbro V is another V Pokemon from the set, 210 HP, with the quick draw poison ability. Once during your turn, if this is your active Pokemon, you may leave your opponent's active Pokemon poisoned. Basically, this is another option for decks that particularly like this poison option, where you don't want to be using Garb as a stage 1. We have ways of moving this out of the active, Switch, Hide Darkness, and Birdkeeper, all very relevant. Toxtricity has seen very, very minimal play, and in general probably doesn't get too much of a buff with this being in the set, but at least it's a basic, not a stage 1. So in general, it's a minor buff to decks that want poison. Even these false swipe decks probably prefer this to Garbodor, gains them a couple of extra consistency spaces. Overall, nothing too much to write home about, but we'll definitely see some experimentation in probably 2 or 3 different archetypes that just need to do 1 extra tick of damage because their damage or their output is basically dependent on it.
Yeah, and even if no one else is experimenting with it, I'm trying Kartana Glimwood Tangle. I've already tried it on our streams, so I'm happy to see Slowbro in the set. Next up we have Hooper. We really love this card, much more than the community by the looks of things. Maybe it's because it's a throwback to Zapdos, but in general, we think that Hooper will have plenty of homes as soon as he comes onto the scene. He's a 120 hit point Dark basic that has the Assault Gate attack. For that 1 Dark cost, you do 90 damage, and if this Pokemon wasn't moved from your bench to your active spot during your turn, this attack does nothing. So it has to have jumped from the bench into the active during that turn. Pretty easy to make that happen with switches and scoop up nets already in the game. Already like Hide Darkness energies that could be on your other Pokemon as well as onto this card. And a 1 for 90, very efficient. It can be dealing with, evolving basics. It can be dealing with Jirachis, which are still a big card in the game. I think Eternatus is going to absolutely love having this card in the deck. It gives you an early tempo option if you want to. It gives you great options against fellow 1-prize card decks, like Baby Blacephalon, for example. Even though you're only doing 90 base damage, Eternatus is always playing Quad Scoop Up Net, Quad Zigzagoon, possibly even Obstagoon in there as well. So sort of zoning in on that Assault Gate and having extra damage counters on top can help you deal with those Blacephalons, which is absolutely excellent. Hooper's tempo as well when you need it to be against things like Decidueye, and obviously it's the only attacking option that you have here outside of potentially Spiritombs. So I think it's minimal a 3 of in Eternatus, which we expect to be one of the top 3 decks probably in the format. Almost definitely already from our testing, I would say. So yeah, he will always be in Eternatus to some amount, but he also has the versatility to also potentially be the face of the new form of Spiritomb. Spiritomb Beast was a very decent deck in the last set. It does get a fresh coat of paint with Spikemuth and the Hooper engine now, and probably has a bit more reliance on Jinx, maybe a little bit slower than it used to be. But a lot of things get hit by rotation, and tempo kind of changes in general, so it's something that we have to adjust to. And I do think Spiritomb may still be one of the stronger 1-prize decks in the format. I think Spiritomb and Blounds and like Decidueye are basically the only 1-prizes that I foresee being relatively good. So I do think Hooper gets some additional brownie points in that regard as well. So giving it the huge praise because it's such a good friend to Eternatus to give you a 1-prize out for some of these more awkward cards like Zamazenta and Decidueye, and also being a tempo card in general. But some extra brownie points for being a potential new 1-prize deck in the format as well.
For sure, yeah, a really strong card. Crobat V is another incredibly strong card, and as you can tell from the community set review, everyone thinks it. It's a V Pokemon with the Night Asset ability. Once during a turn, when you play this Pokemon from your hand to your bench, you may draw cards. Until you have 6 cards in your hand, you can only use 1 Night Asset ability during your turn. Need I say much more? Shaman is one of the strongest cards ever printed. This has the caveat that you can only use it once per turn, and is still one of the strongest cards ever printed. It's really, really good for consistency. Piers lets you add it into any deck and have reliable search, because you're also getting supplementary search for energy. It's the backbone of Eternatus, which, as Joe's just said, will be one of the strongest, if not the strongest deck in format, at least top 3. It's the backbone of that, and in conjunction with Eldegoss and Dedenne, one Eldegoss, one Dedenne, and one Crobat gives decks so many options for the right kind of support they need at the right time. You can discard draw if you really need to dig, you can just draw up if you need a little bit of supplementary draw, or you can search for exactly the support you need with Eldegoss. It's just really, really strong having all 3 of these different cards in format, and being able to apply whichever one suits your deck the best. It means that you don't get decks that that really don't want to play Dedenne but have to be consistent. Now they can play Crobat, but there's no benefit to playing Crobat if you're able to just run a Dedenne engine. There's no downside to having this card in format. It makes everyone's decks more consistent, and like I said, it's the absolute lifeblood of the Eternatus deck, meaning that it's sort of an auto 5-star before you even factor in that it's basically splashable in every deck that increases their consistency sort of tenfold.
Yeah, you can see from the community exactly how strong this card is. It's a no-brainer. Speaking of no-brainers, we move on to Eternatus V and VMAX. Definitely the combination that looks just incredible from the set, to be honest. Even the V impresses me. It's a 220 hit point dark type that has the Power Excel attack. For a colorless, you can do 30, and you can attach a dark energy from your hand to one of your benched Pokemon. This is already like really good news, because Eternatus VMAX is likely going to be a 1 attachment per turn kind of deck, and if you just happen to go second, you can maybe have a bit more defense against things like Crushing Hammers, because you can at least attach an energy to one of your bench dudes. And in our initial list, at the very least, we've been playing Viridian so that we have a higher chance of, firstly, not missing that early game attachment, but also cashing in on the Power Excel. Let's not forget that 30 damage poke can actually be quite relevant into like VMAXs and tag teams, because that Dread End plus like Zigzagoon Scoop Up Net, it's not out of your reach to actually like do that 30 prod into a VMAX into just like killing them with a Dread End, because the attack damage gets crazy. Before we get to that though, the Dynamax Cannon, it's basically never going to be used. I've not ever seen this be used. For a dark and 3 colors, you do 120. If your opponent's active Pokemon is a VMAX, it does 120 more. Super expensive. I don't think I've ever seen it be used, but the VMAX is insane. First of all, let's just discuss the 340 hit points right now. It's disgustingly tanky. It is just so absurd. We haven't really seen things like Snorlax and Copperaja, so we haven't really got to that point where we've seen how disgusting 340 is. But since we've tested Eternatus, I've been like, man, this thing just does not go down. It's so huge. It's just really crazy. It has the Infinity Zone ability. If all of your Pokemon in play are Dark type, you can now have up to 8 Dark Pokemon in play on your bench. Sorry, 8 Dark Pokemon on your bench and still that active. You can't play any other type of Pokemon, and when this ability no longer works, discard your bench Pokemon until there are 5 left. So that means that if Eternatus VMAX is knocked out and it's your only one in play, you then have to like discard cards. Sometimes that can be actually helpful for you. You can remove things like your Crobat Vs. So there's a small interaction there where you can remove easy prizes for the opponent, knowing that, of course, it can either reduce your damage output or you'll have to sort of replace those Pokemon as you get into your next VMAX. But definitely a small interaction to bear in mind, and that's a big reason why we like having so many one-prize Pokemon. You know, a very high count of Zigzagoon and a very high count of Hooper. So if these are getting knocked out, you can then remove those Crobats and remove those easy prizes for the opponent, which can be very cool. And then there's the Dread End attack. For a dark and a colorless, you do 30 times the amount of your dark Pokemon. So that's your 8 bench in the perfect world, as well as your active. So you cap out at 270, which is a very, very good number. I've mentioned so often that the quad Zigzagoon, quad Scoop Up Net is going to be a thing, and there's even potential to have Galarian Obstagoon Rare Candy in the deck as well to push that damage output even further. So going to be extremely versatile, going to be potentially a lot of pressure on the opponent on turn 2. It's a Mega Rayquaza wrapped into a Skyfield in 1 card, which is just absolutely absurd. It has Crobat for draw, and it even has space, man. It's crazy that this deck kind of like builds itself for about 55 or so cards, and then you're like, what else can I play? So far, we've thought about things like Dangerous Drill and Crushing Hammer to add some disruption, maybe even a mirror match element in there as well. There's also the option to have Weavile. If you want to play red and blue, you can have some potential energy acceleration on your own end so that you're not as affected by your opponent's crushing hammers or dangerous drills, for example, or just having the Weavile GX so that you can move around your attackers a little bit easier. You can hide energy onto one thing, retreat out, and although you can't move that hide energy itself, you can move other basic energies onto your other stuff as well. So the Weavile does give you a little bit more flexibility. It makes things like Hooper a lot more usable as a card as well. So all things to bear in mind, but let's just face the facts. The raw stats on this card are crazy. It hits like a truck, it has a huge amount of tanking, and with 4 Crobat like forced into the deck, basically, you have a good amount of consistency. So that just ticks so many boxes for being a top tier threat, in my opinion.
Yeah, entirely. This is definitely going to be one of the strongest decks in the format, and from our early testing, it's no joke. It's really, really threatening. Finally, we have, for the Dark Pokemon, I believe, we have Galarian Obstagoon. This is the second Obstagoon we've got. 170 HP, stage 2. With the Bad Ruler ability, once during a turn, you may have your opponent discard cards from their hands until they have 4 cards left. Pretty disruptive ability, but unfortunately, it's nowhere near as disruptive as Make and Pay Persian was, simply because they get to choose the cards. So they're just going to keep their 4 best cards, which is not ideal. In general, you can do kind of sort of weird things where your opponent, you're sort of building this board up, maybe even in Eternatus more than anything, where your opponent has to deal with this 340 HP monster, and then every turn they have to make sure they're forced to only have 4 cards in hand. But in general, we then remember that Marnie is in format, and that forces your opponent to, yes, 5 cards, but 5 and 4 are relatively indifferent, and you're also getting supporter draw on your end, so being more consistent yourself. And in general, it's just not worth the stage 2 sort of price tag that you pay, especially when we have such a good Galarian Obstagoon already in the format. I think in general it's just outshone by the one we currently have, for an effect that seems very, very strong, but actually is achieved in various other ways in the format, i.e. basically Marnie.
Yeah, I agree. I think Marnie is just like the go-to for Eternatus, and if I'm rare candying into an Obstagoon, I want that damage if I'm playing Eternatus, or if I'm playing, the Obstruct deck, I want to be always evolving into Obstruct, because the other stuff doesn't matter most of the time, and often you want to be, solo obstructing with no bench Pokemon, so it doesn't make sense to try and set up another stage 2. We move on to Metal now, and we have another VMAX. Sizzle, however, doesn't seem too impressive. The basic is a 210 Metal type with the Tear Off attack. You do 30 for 1, and you discard a tool and a special energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. Can be disruptive, can punish things like attaching hide energies, attaching capture energies as well, which are relevant, especially with Piers around. There's a few twin energy attackers out there right now, which is interesting, but ultimately just a bit of a pain for the opponent and making them play around a couple bits here and there. There's the Slash Claw attack for Metal Colorless. Let's not forget Turbo Patch is in format. Turbo Patch and Metal Saucer, more importantly. You have that 140. It's not really a good baseline when you think of things like Zacian. The VMAX also doesn't seem too impressive. 320 hit points isn't quite as tanky as Copperaja. You can maybe make up for that by using the Hard Scissors attack, though. For a Metal and a Colorless, you do 90 during your next turn. This Pokemon takes 30 less damage from attacks. And we also have the Max Steel Spike for Metal Colorless, 190 Vanilla. It is quite nice having Vanilla. It just means that he's sat there kind of just churning away, and you can try and make him more tanky with the full Metal Wall GX, and although we do lose the Frying Pan, we still have Goggles for some extra reduction here. But ultimately, I think he's kind of outclassed by Copperaja VMAX, and the lack of play that Copperaja VMAX saw really makes me skeptical for Sizzle. I don't think he's got good enough damage output or good enough tanking to build around when we still have Zacian Zamazenta as basics that pretty much outshine this card almost all the time.
Yeah, definitely. Next up we have Galarian Stunfisk V, a basic V Pokemon with 200 HP, Metal type with the Metal Skin ability. Pokemon's max HP is increased by 20 for each metal energy attached to it. That means it can actually get pretty big. Having all energy increase your HP is pretty interesting when you have things like Turbo Patch and Metal Saucer to be able to burst a lot of energy on, as well as Toughness Cape to actually make this thing, pretty realistically, probably 300 plus HP. You don't mind attaching more energy to something that's not dying, so whilst it's only 20 per energy, it still might be worth maybe even attaching 3 or 4 energy just to make sure you're out of range of certain attacks that your opponent is setting up. The attack is pretty interesting as well. Trap Bite for 2 colorless energy to 60 damage, and if this Pokemon is damaged by an attack during your opponent's next turn, put 12 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. That's a lot of counters, and in all honesty, that's being able to do theoretically 180 for 2 is pretty scary. It's very efficient, especially on something that seems pretty difficult to knock out. You can complement this with something like a giant bomb, which is pretty interesting, though maybe your opponent, because it kind of forces your opponent to not want to do too much damage, which means they're going to find it harder to churn through a lot of this HP you're adding on. Otherwise, they're going to be taking potentially 22 damage counters if they attack you, which is just stupid good. So yeah, it's definitely a really, really interesting Pokemon, and could be maybe the face of a sort of more controlling metal type build, maybe completely sort of omitting the Zacians from like a Luca Metal build and just going Luca Metal plus Galarian Stunfisk and basically saying, yes, I'm only doing 60 a turn, but if you attack me, you're going to take 120 every turn, and eventually that will be enough damage to take me 6 prizes. You do have supplementary damage with Berserker as well, so it's actually a card I'm pretty excited to try out. I don't think it's going to be groundbreaking at all, but I think it's actually got some pretty decent stats, and there will be situations where you really put your opponent in a bit of an awkward spot because you can Trap Bite them in combination with something like a Stamp so they can't find a boss. Obviously, you don't want to see boss with this deck because they're just going to get around that Trap Bite, but in general, like I say, Trap Bite in combination with a Reset Stamp or a Marnie can sometimes mean your opponent either can't attack you or really has to think about whether they want to take these 12 counters. So it's going to be definitely an interesting one to try out. Probably not groundbreaking, but like I say, definitely a very interesting archetype that I think could see a little bit of experimentation.
Yeah, that's what I like about this card, really. It's just, we've already got a nice shell there immediately. And what's cool about this exact sort of like bait into hit me kind of thing is that, like, if they are gusting, you're just getting even bigger because you can just commit even more energies to this card. So there'll be a point where it's like, it's either they can't even deal with this card or they have to start taking those big damage chunks. So it's going to be a nice tempo sort of question mark for the opponent to deal with each time. We move on to Klinklang. It's a stage 2 metal type Pokemon with 150 hit points. It has 2 attacks. The first, for 2 colorless, is 60 damage, simple beam with no text. And the second attack is Clockwork. For a metal and 2 colorless, you do 200. But if there are no Clink or Clang on your bench, this attack does nothing. You can basically write off that text, because if you don't have a Clink or Clank on the bench, you're pretty much losing the game no matter what if you're building completely around this Clink Clang. All it does really is tell you that you have to like commit to this deck, and it can't really be like a tech card, but who has tech stage 2s these days anyway? It can have some extra damage buff by like Berserker and stuff like that, and maybe you can try and make this guy a little bit tanky with Metal Core Barrier, but at the end of the day, still a stage 2. 200 isn't very good damage, even with, you know, the acceleration pieces that you have here and there. It's just a lot of work for ultimately just a fun stage 2.
For sure. Next up we have Copperaja, another 1-star card unfortunately. This one is a little bit more interesting though. 190 HP on a stage 1, as you know, is pretty impressive, especially when you're only giving up 1 prize. The ability is antibacterial skin, can't be affected by special conditions. Niche uses here and there, but overall not too great. Revenge Stomp doing 120 for 4 energy, 2 metal and 2 colorless. And if any of your bench Pokemon have any more damage counters on them, this attack does 120 more. So 240 for 4 on a stage 1 prizer is actually pretty good. But unfortunately, you really can't stream this very well. It's not a particularly easy Pokemon to get powered up. You need Twin Energy plus Metal Sources to get it powered up in a turn. And whilst 190 on a stage 1 prizer is, like, the stats on this card are actually pretty nice, except from that energy cost. And the energy cost just really drags this card down because you can't consistently stream this card. You need a card like this to be very streamable in order for it to break a meta game, because otherwise you're just going to be an inconsistent mess. And unfortunately, because you can't stream this Revenge Stomp, despite having 190 HP on a 1 prizer and doing 240, it's just really not realistic that you're going to be able to make a consistent shell out of this because you require so much energy to attack every turn.
Yeah, we've basically seen this exact shell on the previous Copperaja, so they've kept it thematic, but that one saw no play, and this one's, even more work, so that definitely spells trouble. We move on to the colourless stuff now, and we start off with a Revenge Attacker in Kangaskhan. It's a colourless 130 hit point basic that has Retaliate. You do 30, and if any of your Pokemon were knocked out by damage from your opponent's attack during their last turn, this does 90 more damage for that 2 colourless cost, or just a Twin Energy to go with. We've mentioned a couple Twin Energy attackers so far in today's video, but we aren't really excited by any of them. And this Kangaskhan isn't going to be strong enough to push them much further. Like, maybe it's a one-off addition just so that, you can have that bit of respite here or there where you can miss a Wimpod and still do some damage to maybe finish things off here and there. So it's kind of filling that cool niche, but at the moment we don't have enough real Twin Energy Pokemon to take advantage of this as a one-off option. Also, you're a colorless type, so you hit like nothing for weakness, which is a big issue. And that hammering, just vanilla 3 for 100, it's super below the bar. So we've seen some decent Retaliate or like Revenge style attackers in the past. This one's good to just be aware of, but at the moment it's not really filling much purpose.
For sure. Next up we have Dunsparce, which is a little bit more interesting. Dunsparce is a 60 HP basic that has the One Last Dig ability. This Pokemon is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack. Discard the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck. As we've said multiple times, we don't know what direction Mill is going in, control, lock, style archetypes. It's going to take someone a little bit more sort of affluent in those types of decks to work out. But in general, we can both see this as kind of maybe a tech early game attacker. You're going to be sitting on your bench with Dolls in the active. You're going to be sitting on your bench, having Zacian on the bench, using Intrepid Sword every turn. So why not throw out some Dunsparce and start getting some chip sort of discards in early on in the game, in combination with something like a Curse Shovel. It can actually be pretty disruptive. It's not going to break the meta, but now we don't have Orangaroos in the active every turn. We might need to be a little bit more aggressive digging through our opponent's deck because we don't have access to so much reload of our own. So maybe Dunsparce is the nice break point for the early turns to be able to try and get rid of some of the some of the cards that initially we would have been able to get back. Things like Belobra and Bryson Man with Orangaroo in the past. Now we can't do that, so we kind of have to be a little bit more aggressive on the mill option, and in general probably have to maybe throw this guy up with a shovel attached and try and do some early digging at our opponent's deck, rather than just sort of sitting there with Dolls and Intrepid Swording every turn.
Yeah, without Orangaroo, you have to be a lot more like passive and cautious with your own deck, because we're finally seeing the effect of Belelba being, symmetrical. Previously you didn't care because you either had like no deck and would just finish on Orangaroo, or you could finish on Orangaroo for anything you milled that was important. Now I feel like we'll just, rather than having a shed ton of Cinccino's and getting like really thin with the deck, we'll more often than not just sort of end our turn on an Intrepid Sword every single time, but then have other stage ones like Delcatty and have like scoop up nets and just try and like piece out those Belelbas with like Tag Call Engine and stuff like that, but not really actually like filter our deck quite as much. So just having 4 Dolls and 4 Dunsparce with Curse Shovels and just sort of like letting them sit there is probably going to be more realistic to what's going to happen in the future. So that's kind of the direction I can see a Belelba based mill going, and these extra 2, 4 or so cards that get milled is all towards the cause. So I think it may be reasonable going forward to at least experiment with. We move on to another V and VMAX pairing. Again, one that a few people are quite excited about. It's a 220 hit point basic, the regular Salamence V. It has Transflight for 3 colors, so you do 30 to each of your opponent's Pokemon. That's actually really decent damage. It's a buffed up flying flip, if you will. And it is for 3 colorless, so you could potentially get this going in a turn with a welder and an attachment, something to bear in mind. Or if you are going down the crazy code route, you can have a ton of energies flooded onto it all at one go. And it also has the Heavy Storm attack, which is for 4 colorless 160. You can try and buff this with powerful colorless energy as well if you want to be able to like pick off the Crobats and the Dedenes of the world, something to bear in mind. But for the most part, we're looking towards this Salamence V Max. It has 320 hit points. It's a colorless Pokemon that has a 1 attack cost in Twin Sonic. I really like that in a similar way to how we mentioned Center Scorch. If you're not drawing well, you're at least still doing something. That's certainly the case still with this Salamence VMAX, where you can do 40 to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. That does include the active, so if you are stacking 1 or 2 colorless powerful energy onto yourself, you can do a little bit of extra snipe damage. And I feel that's often very important for being able to finish off VMAXs. If you're able to do like a 60 poke or an 80 poke onto the active and a 40 to the bench, that sets you up relatively well for max wing, as long as you can retain these powerful colorless energies. So I wouldn't sleep on those. We have that max wing attack, which is the main damage output here. For 4 colorless, you do 240, and during your next turn, this Pokemon can't use max wing. Now, I have put the Welder engine as an option here, but I think for the most part, if you're trying to build a VMAX deck that's Welder based, it has to be Center Scorch. So I'm going to focus most of my discussion towards the Porygon list. Because I feel like there's actually a lot of good synergy with the Porygon. I've already mentioned how important powerful colorless energy is for the damage output of this Salamence, but I also think having access to Capture Energy to find your early game Porygons and stuff is a really big deal and helps the stage 2 element of this deck quite a lot. Having Recycle Energy also gives you some actual win conditions, I think, because you can pay the 2 retreat costs on your Salamence much more freely, because you can just reattach them with Crazy Code to another Salamence later down the line, or like in that turn even, or you can just set up another attacker if you want to, which is awesome. And you can also have Hyper Potions, which I think is actually like super good healing from an item that we've never really had the benefit of. And finally, with like a Porygon Z Recycle Energy effect, we can start seeing that actually be useful. So Porygon Z obviously has a lot of drawbacks. You're stage 2, there's going to be consistency issues, but if you weave in a few Triple XLs already into the list, you can kind of make up for that getting knocked out, or make up for it being missed on the second turn of the game. And even if all of that sort of goes to pot, you can still Twin Sonic, which is like a reasonable setup attack for either trying to set things like Jirachi's in range of a Transflight later on, or, you know, a double Twin Sonic can knock that out and also set up a VMAX for multiple prize knockout turns. It can help play around Reset Stamp, which is nice. We already have other snipers that are colorless based as well in Cramorant V, which is something to bear in mind, because Beat Catch is also a nice early game attack. So yeah, I think the fact that you're colorless, the fact that you can take advantage of so many special energies, and the fact that Hyper Potion may be like the forgotten card of the format that's actually useful if you can play like a couple copies in a turn, because there's nothing stopping you from Hyper Potioning, reattaching 2 Recycle Energies, Hyper Potioning, reattaching those 2 recycles. So you can have some big swing turns and undo a lot of damage, but this is going to be setup based at the end of the day, so there's going to be some question marks for consistency. That's why we've only rated it the 3-star compared to some of these other VMAX options.
Sure, I think Salamence has a lot of options, and I think it will undoubtedly be good at some point in its time and standard. And I think even if it's not the most consistent option, and maybe Welder is more consistent, like you said, you'd rather play Center Scorch as a Welder deck, so why not try something a little bit different for the Salamence version, the Salamence deck, and Porygon Z has been fun if nothing else. So yeah, pretty excited about this one. On to Greedent. Unfortunately, a 1-star card, 120 HP, with the first attack Scrape Off, doing 20 damage for 1 energy, and you can discard all tools attached to your opponent's active Pokemon before you do damage. And second attack doing Hit and Run for 100 damage for 2 energy, and you can return this Pokemon and all cards attached to it into your hand. We have a variety of good hit and run Pokemon to go into. Galarian Weezing is Ability Lock, Zamazenta is VMAX Denial, and Decidueye, obviously we mentioned earlier, being V and Pokemon GX Denial or Lock, as well as Dolls. So there's a fair few different hit and run or sort of targets we can hit and run into. But unfortunately, Behemoth is seeing very little to no play right now, and for 10 less damage you can get Item Lock, and that seems really, really strong. So even though Behemoth is probably a little bit less consistent because it loses things like Treasure, Greedent going back to the hand is actually also pretty unfortunate, because Marnie is such a strong card in the format right now. You can Greedent, hit and run, go into whatever, your opponent can Marnie away your Greedent, and all of a sudden if you can't find a Greedent for a turn, you're going to be really starting to struggle. Whereas with Behemoth, at least you're getting Item Lock, so you're preventing what your opponent can do. Maybe a combination of item lock plus Galarian Weezing is enough that they actually can't do anything. So in general, it's just a case that even though Greedent does a little bit more damage for a little bit of a cheaper cost, and arguably it's better going into the hand than shuffling into the deck now that we lose treasure, Behemoth providing item lock and probably still seeing no play probably means the grave is already dug for Greedent overall.
Yeah, I just think that 100 is such a low baseline. The only real hope I have for this card is how strong we've seen Zamazenta be against Eternatus. That you could be this super fringe deck that just like kind of just plays 2 Zamazenta and feasts on Eternatus, and maybe this list has a slightly better Center Scorch than like the Luke Metal build, because Luke Metal kind of gets rolled by Center Scorch. Maybe Greedent playing like enough dolls can have a slightly better matchup than just a straight Luke Metal Hammers type effect. So it has some extreme niches for exactly the 2 like VMAX decks coming out in the format. Maybe that gives it enough, warrants enough sort of practice, but I still think there'll be those headaches, like you said. There'll be Marnies, you'll be just missing damage, and 100 is such a pitiful number. Like 4-shotting on Eternatus, like come on, that's so much work, man. It's really not looking great. We go on to Corviknight. It's a stage 2 colorless that has 160 hit points. The ability is the thing of note here with Flying Taxi. Once during a turn, when you play this card from your hand to evolve a Pokemon, you may choose one of your Pokemon, excluding Corviknight, return that Pokemon and all cards attached to it to your hand. Really does remind me of the old Max Wind Dragonite. Max Wind Dragonite was actually, I believe, a stronger effect because it just straight up healed your guy. But this is still a decent effect, and I'm most looking at this for undoing a bunch of damage, basically. We've lost Super Scoop Up from the format, so the main way that we could have this big chunk of heal outside of things like Hyper Potion and Malolana could be this Corviknight. It's a lot of work because it's a stage 2 to get in play, but for some of these VMAXs that can get away with 1 attachment per turn, potentially even the Snorlax VMAX that just has the triple acceleration available to it, you can get away with this. You can take a big chunk of damage with this VMAX, then you can just evolve into your Corviknight, pick it all back up, re-evolve into a new Snorlax, attach your energy. Same thing with Salamence, you can just attach and go for a Twin Sonic play. So, interesting to be honest. Kind of awkward that Boss is still in the format, and if you are playing VMAX, you need to always have the regular V sat on the bench that your opponent can pick off. At the same time, you're stage 2, so it's a lot of work, and you won't always hit it at the right time, and it's a lot of clunk factor in addition to the fact that you're playing stage 1s. So there are those headaches. Also, I'm looking forward to playing some tankier basic builds that potentially have more space in them. The only real thing that I find a little bit awkward here is that the Torkoal and the Luke Metal Zamazenta style decks, they all have, like relatively high attack costs. So obviously Torkoal can like re-establish quite quickly with a Welder, but it's all combinations, and when you're playing a stage 2, combinations are kind of hard to come by. So these are all things that I am a little bit cynical of, but worth noting, seeing as though how weak sort of options we have for healing right now in the game. Malolana is 120, and there was a point where that was excellent in the game, but with Eternatus, like new meta being like 270, we need a lot more healing if we're going to start having tank archetypes in the game, so this could be the only option, really.
Definitely. And that is it. That was an absolute slog. We counted up all of the different set ratings, so you can compare and contrast how we rated compared to how the community rated. In general, we were more harsh with the 1 stars and a little bit more generous with the 5 stars, and the sort of the 2 to 4 stars were where there was a bit more overlap. In general, we don't like rating between 2 and 4 stars if we can. It feels like they're much more sort of hedging your bet rating, so we try to go for 1 or 5 stars if we can, or at least I guess 2 or 4. 3 star is basically the one that we like to have the least of. But yeah, in general, you can see the 6 cards we rated as 5-star here, and you can see that 5 of them are dark or dark Pokemon or acceleration, and the 6th is universal acceleration that is probably going to be in dark depth as well. So you can tell this is a really, really interesting set for dark types, but there are a couple of sort of niche archetypes coming out from this set as well, which is pretty exciting considering it feels like it's been forever since Rebel Clash came out. So yeah, really, really exciting stuff coming up.
So the TLDR for your friends, or if you forgot anything, Here is something you can just screenshot and send over to them, or tell them to click on the video, skip to the end. Here are the rating summaries. Here for the trainers, the most impactful ones we think will be the Turbo Patch. Piers looking very good. Rose is definitely a fun option. Toughness Cape, great for a bunch of V Pokemon, keeping the basics relevant, not that they need help. A lot of interesting special energy cards, some stadiums as well that could see a little bit of play. And as we move on to the types, really it's Decidueye that looks to be a decent archetype depending on how the meta sort of shapes up. Eternatus certainly looks to be the strongest archetype out the gate. Salamence has some flexibility options going on there, so it's going to be interesting to see how that shapes up. Centiskorch can sort of work on his own, but does feel over the top powerful if you have those early game power spike turns. And we also have Vikavolt, which is potentially new item lock PogChamp. Those are the ones that we feel are the strongest overall.
For sure. Thank you very much for watching. Like I say, it's been an absolute mission, but we obviously really enjoy doing these set reviews. Make sure you leave down below what card you're most excited for, what deck you're most excited for from this set. There's going to be some pretty interesting archetypes. Me and Joe have been streaming over on Twitch, basically as often as we can, doing some early testing, and as soon as the set comes out, we will be getting straight back onto PTCGO with at least very, very early testing of the decks. We usually, or at least one of us usually streams like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, sort of Monday, Tuesday of that first weekend, just because it's all new and shiny. So yeah, make sure you check us out on all of the various other places you can find us. And like I say, let us know down below what cards and decks you're excited for from this set as well, because there's definitely a variety of different archetypes coming out that look interesting.
Thanks so much for watching, guys. As always, if you disagree with any of these, if you're hyped for stuff, get it all in the discussion down below. We'll try and reply to as much as possible. That's it for today. Thanks so much for sticking through with us. It's been a long one, and we'll see you in one of our new Darkness Ablaze videos soon. Cheers.